The Atacama Desert in northern Chile is one of the driest places on Earth. With virtually no light pollution, minimal atmospheric interference, and over 300 clear nights per year, it has become home to some of the most sophisticated astronomical equipment humanity has ever built. The high-altitude Celestial Mapping Station, perched at nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, operates 24 hours a day, methodically scanning and cataloguing the heavens with precision instruments that can detect objects billions of light years away. On the night of March 17th, astronomer Marcus Webb was conducting a routine deep sky survey. At 42 years old, Webb had spent nearly 2 decades studying the cosmos, and the rhythms of observatory work had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The evening shift was typically quiet. Just him, the hum of cooling systems, and the silent rotation of the massive telescope as it swept across predetermined coordinates. Webb's task that night was straightforward: photograph specific sectors of the southern sky to update the station's stellar catalogue. These surveys happened quarterly, creating a running archive of cosmic snapshots that astronomers could reference to track changes over time: supernovae, variable stars, asteroid movements, anything that shifted or evolved in the great celestial theatre. At approximately 11:45 in the evening, Webb directed the telescope toward a familiar region, the constellation Centaurus. As the image appeared on his monitor, he performed his usual visual check before saving the file. Then he paused. Something was wrong. Alpha Centauri, the brightest star in the constellation and one of the closest star systems to Earth, appeared slightly out of position. Not dramatically, just enough that Webb's experienced eye caught the discrepancy immediately. The star seemed to have drifted perhaps half a degree from where it should be, a shift that placed it noticeably off from its catalogued coordinates. Webb's first thought was instrument malfunction. Telescopes, despite their precision, occasionally experience tracking errors or calibration drift. He ran a quick diagnostic on the mount's alignment system. Everything checked out. He then examined the atmospheric conditions. Sometimes thermal layers or unusual air density could create optical distortions. The night was exceptionally clear, with seeing conditions rated as excellent. Still, the star remained in the wrong place. Webb pulled up the reference catalogue on his secondary monitor, comparing the live telescope feed with archived star charts. According to every database available, Alpha Centauri should be precisely where it had always been. Yet his telescope showed it elsewhere. A cold sensation of unease began to creep through Webb's chest. He had observed Alpha Centauri hundreds of times. He knew this region of sky intimately. This wasn't a matter of misidentification or amateur error. Something fundamental had changed. He adjusted the telescope to scan the surrounding stars in Centaurus. Beta Centauri appeared normal. Proxima Centauri, Alpha's distant companion, seemed correctly positioned. But as he continued his survey, he noticed additional discrepancies, subtle shifts in at least 4 other stars within a roughly 10-degree sector of sky. The stars hadn't scattered randomly. They appeared to have moved in relation to one another, maintaining some of their original geometric relationships, while creating a new, slightly altered configuration. The constellation's overall shape remained recognizable, but specific stellar positions within it had definitely changed. Webb sat back in his chair, trying to calm the acceleration of his pulse. In all his years of astronomy, he had never encountered anything like this. Stars don't move perceptibly on human timescales. Their proper motion across the sky is measured in tiny fractions of arc seconds per year, changes so minuscule that they take decades or centuries to become noticeable, even with precision instruments. What he was seeing represented an impossible shift, something that couldn't occur naturally without cataclysmic stellar events that would be obvious and dramatic. There were no recorded supernovae in this region, no gamma-ray bursts, no gravitational anomalies, just stars that appeared to be in the wrong places. Webb reached for his phone to call the station director, then hesitated. Making this report would trigger a cascade of scrutiny, equipment audits, potential accusations of procedural error, skepticism from colleagues. He needed to be absolutely certain before raising an alarm. He spent the next hour running every verification protocol he knew. He recalibrated the telescope mount completely, performed a full system reset, and even cross-referenced the coordinates with GPS synchronized timing systems to ensure the telescope was pointing exactly where the computer indicated. The results remained consistent. The stars had moved. The calibration check. By 1:30 in the morning, Webb had exhausted his immediate diagnostic options. Everything about the telescope and its supporting systems appeared to be functioning normally. The equipment was telling him exactly what it was designed to tell him, the precise location of the objects it was observing. The problem was that those locations contradicted centuries of accumulated astronomical data. Webb decided to approach the problem systematically. If the telescope was somehow providing false positional information, then automated sky mapping software should reveal the error when comparing the current observations with its internal star catalogues. He loaded the night's images into the station's astrometric analysis program, software specifically designed to identify celestial objects and verify their positions against known catalogues. The program worked by recognizing star patterns, unique arrangements of brightness and relative position that served as celestial fingerprints. The software processed the images and returned its results. Webb stared at the screen, his unease deepening into something approaching fear. The program had successfully identified the region as Centaurus. It recognized the constellation's overall pattern, but it flagged multiple stars as having anomalous positional values. In the software's assessment, the field contained stars that matched the spectral signatures and brightness characteristics of known Centaurus stars, but their coordinates didn't align with catalogue positions. The program effectively confirmed what Webb's eyes were telling him. The stars themselves were correct, but they were in the wrong places. Webb ran the analysis 3 more times, using different reference catalogues. The Yale Bright Star catalogue, the Hipparcos database, even older printed atlases that he scanned and digitized. Every comparison yielded the same troubling conclusion. The constellation had changed. What made this particularly unsettling was the specificity of the discrepancy. The shifted stars were all contained within a defined sector of approximately 8 to 12 degrees, a circular region centered roughly on Alpha Centauri. Outside this zone, stars appeared exactly where they should be. Inside it, multiple objects had relocated by amounts ranging from 0.3 to 0.7 degrees. Those numbers might seem small, but in astronomical terms, they were enormous. A shift of half a degree is equivalent to the apparent diameter of the full moon. These were not subtle instrumental artifacts or rounding errors. These were significant, measurable displacements. Webb began photographing adjacent regions of sky, building a wider survey to understand the boundaries of whatever phenomenon he was observing. He spent the next 2 hours systematically mapping the surrounding area, creating a grid of overlapping images that covered roughly 40 degrees of the southern celestial sphere. As the data accumulated, the pattern became clearer and more disturbing. The positional anomalies were contained within a near-perfect circle in the sky. Stars just outside this boundary appeared normal. Stars just inside showed various degrees of displacement, with the largest shifts occurring near the centre of the affected region. It looked, for all the world, like something had reached into that specific patch of sky and rearranged its contents. By 3 a.m, Webb had documented everything he could with the equipment available to him. He had created a comprehensive map of the affected zone, complete with before and after comparisons using archived images from previous surveys. The evidence was irrefutable. Something had changed in the sky, and that change had occurred sometime between the last quarterly survey, 3 months ago, and tonight. Webb finally picked up the phone and called Isabella Torres, the station's director. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. This had better be important, Marcus. Isabella, I need you to come to the observatory, right now. Something in his tone cut through her grogginess. What's wrong? Equipment failure? No, everything's working perfectly. That's the problem. You're not making sense, I know. Just please come, and bring the master keys. I want to use the backup telescope for independent verification. There was a pause. Independent verification. Of what? Webb stared at the monitor, at the constellation that wasn't quite right, at the stars that had somehow moved across light years of space without anyone noticing. The stars, he said quietly, the stars have moved. The time comparison. Isabella Torres arrived at the observatory 40 minutes later, her hair hastily pulled back, concern etched across her features. She found Webb in the main observation room, surrounded by printouts and multiple monitors displaying star charts, data tables, and comparison images. "Show me," she said without preamble. Webb guided her through his findings methodically, starting with the initial observation and walking her through each verification step. Torres listened in silence, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching alarm as the evidence accumulated. She was a careful scientist, trained to doubt extraordinary claims, but she was also experienced enough to recognize thorough work when she saw it. Webb had covered every reasonable explanation. His documentation was impeccable. "Pull up the archive," she said finally. "I want to see the historical data." The Atacama station maintained digital archives going back 17 years, along with digitized versions of photographic plates dating back more than 60 years. Webb had already begun this comparison, but Torres wanted to verify it herself. They started with the most recent quarterly survey from 3 months prior. The constellation appeared completely normal, every star in its expected position, matching the reference catalogues perfectly. They went back further, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. In every archived image, Centaurus appeared exactly as astronomical databases predicted it should appear. The constellation's configuration had remained stable throughout the entire observational record. "What about proper motion?" Torres asked, grasping for a rational explanation. "These stars do move over time, just slowly. Could this be accumulated?" "No," Webb interrupted gently. "I checked that. Alpha Centauri's proper motion is 0.8 arc seconds per year. To shift by the half degree I'm measuring would take approximately 2,200 years. And that would be gradual drift in a single direction, not the coordinated movement we're seeing across multiple stars." Torres pulled up the current live feed and compared it side by side with an image from 6 months earlier. The difference was obvious once you knew to look for it. The constellation's familiar pattern remained recognizable, but specific stars within it had definitely relocated. "This is impossible," Torres whispered. "I know. Stars don't just move like this. The energy required, the physics involved." "I know." Torres sat down heavily, her mind racing through implications. If this was real, if the positional shift they were measuring was genuine, it represented something beyond any natural astronomical phenomenon that they understood. Stars were fixed in their positions relative to each other on human timescales. They orbited the galactic centre together, maintaining their mutual arrangements like boats anchored in a cosmic harbour. What they were looking at suggested that multiple stars, separated by light years of actual distance, had somehow changed their positions in space, or at least changed their positions as observed from Earth. "We need to contact other observatories," Torres said decisively. "If this is real, others will see it too. If it's some bizarre equipment error or atmospheric phenomenon unique to this location, we'll find out quickly." Webb nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing Torres voice it made the situation feel more real, more urgent. "Who do we call first?" he asked. Torres considered. "The European Southern Observatory in La Silla. They're only about 200 kilometres north of us. Similar latitude, similar observational window. If they're observing the same region tonight, they might have noticed something. And if they haven't, then we wake them up and ask them to look." Torres moved to the communication station and began drafting an urgent message to their colleagues at La Silla. She kept the language professionally neutral, describing an anomalous positional measurement that required independent confirmation, but Webb could hear the tension in her voice as she composed the text. While she worked on communications, Webb returned to the telescope and continued his systematic survey. He expanded his search beyond Centaurus, examining neighbouring constellations to map the full extent of the affected region. Crux, the Southern Cross, appeared normal. Carina showed no anomalies. Vela, Centaurus's neighbour to the west, seemed unaffected. The positional discrepancies remained confined to that specific circular sector centred on Alpha Centauri. The geometric precision of the boundary was deeply unsettling. Natural phenomena tended toward diffusion and irregularity. Atmospheric effects created fuzzy edges and gradient transitions. What Webb was measuring had sharp boundaries and internal organisation. It looked designed. That thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cool desert night air filtering through the observatory's ventilation system. He pushed it away, forcing himself to focus on data collection rather than speculation. Torres finished her message to La Silla and moved on to drafting similar communications to observatories in Australia, South Africa and Argentina, facilities that would have visual access to the southern sky and the technical capability to verify or refute what they were seeing. "Response from La Silla," Torres announced suddenly, reading from her screen. "They're checking now. They hadn't been observing Centaurus tonight, but they're redirecting a telescope to the coordinates we specified." Webb and Torres waited in tense silence. Outside, the desert night continued its eternal stillness. Inside the observatory, machines hummed their electronic songs, processing light that had travelled for years across the void to reach them. Webb's phone buzzed with an encrypted message, La Silla's preliminary report. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The message was brief. Positional anomalies confirmed. Alpha Centauri offset by approximately 0.48 degrees. Multiple additional stars in sector showing coordinate discrepancies. Equipment diagnostics normal. Requesting immediate coordination. Webb showed the message to Torres. They stared at each other in the dim light of the observation room. "It's global," Torres said quietly. "This isn't local. It's not our equipment. This is real." "What could possibly cause this?" Webb asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Torres shook her head slowly. "Nothing natural. Nothing I can think of. If stars have actually moved, if their physical positions in space have changed, we should be detecting massive gravitational disturbances, energy releases that would be visible across multiple wavelengths. But we're not," Webb finished. "Whatever this is, it's quiet, subtle." "No," Torres corrected, her voice taking on an edge of fear. "It's precise. This isn't chaos or natural disruption. Someone moved those stars deliberately. Someone arranged them into a new pattern." The word "someone" hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to fully articulate. On the monitors around them, the constellation that wasn't quite right continued its slow rotation across the screen, stars burning steadily in their new, impossible positions. And somewhere in the distance between worlds, something vast and incomprehensible maintained its silence. Multi-observatory confirmation. By sunrise, the Atacama station had received responses from 8 astronomical facilities across 3 continents. Every observatory that examined the Centaurus region confirmed identical findings. Multiple stars showing positional discrepancies ranging from 0.3 to 0.7 degrees, all contained within a circular sector approximately 10 degrees in diameter, centered on Alpha Centauri. The consistency of the measurements ruled out equipment, malfunction, or locational atmospheric phenomena. Whatever had caused the apparent stellar displacement was affecting observations globally. Isabella Torres had barely slept. She'd spent the pre-dawn hours coordinating with facility directors, comparing data sets, and trying to maintain a veneer of scientific calm while internally grappling with the impossibility of what they were documenting. Marcus Webb, operating on caffeine and nervous energy, continued his systematic observations throughout the night. He'd expanded his survey to cover a 100-degree section of the southern sky, creating a detailed map that showed the precise boundaries of the affected region. The anomaly zone formed a near-perfect circle when projected onto the celestial sphere. Stars outside the boundary appeared exactly where centuries of observation predicted they should be. Stars inside had shifted by varying amounts, with displacement magnitude generally increasing toward the zone's centre. At 7 in the morning, Torres convened an emergency video conference with representatives from the confirming observatories. Faces appeared on the main monitor, tired astronomers from Chile, Australia, South Africa, and Argentina, all wearing expressions that mixed scientific fascination with barely concealed concern. "Let's establish what we know for certain," Torres began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "First, can we confirm that all facilities are measuring consistent positional offsets for the same stars?" Heads nodded around the virtual table. A woman from the Australian National Observatory spoke up. "We're seeing Alpha Centauri displaced by 0.47 degrees from catalogue position. Beta Centauri appears unchanged. Proxima shows no anomaly. But we're counting at least 12 stars within the sector showing measurable shifts." "Consistent with our measurements," confirmed an astronomer from the South African Astronomical Observatory. "We've also verified against historical plates. These positions have been stable for at least 80 years of photographic record. The change occurred sometime between December and now." "Atmospheric refraction," someone suggested, though the tone indicated they already knew the answer. "Ruled out," Webb responded. "The pattern is consistent across different atmospheric conditions and viewing angles from widely separated locations. Refraction would create systematic errors that vary with altitude and azimuth. What we're seeing is positionally stable regardless of observing angle. Gravitational lensing from an intervening massive object, another voice offered. Torres shook her head. The displacement pattern doesn't match gravitational lensing predictions. Lensing creates distortion that depends on the alignment geometry between observer, lens and source. It changes over time as objects move. This is static. The stars appear to have relocated to new fixed positions. Then what are we looking at? The question came from the Argentine representative, a veteran astronomer named Rafael Mendoza. Because if stars have physically moved light years through space in a matter of months, we should be detecting gravitational waves, massive energy expenditures, disrupted planetary systems. We should see something beyond just altered positions. The conference fell into uncomfortable silence. Everyone understood the implication. The observed phenomenon couldn't be explained by stars physically relocating through space. Yet it also couldn't be explained by any known observational artifact or natural distortion effect. There's one more thing, Webb said quietly, pulling up an image on his screen and sharing it with the conference. Look at this. The image showed the affected region with the displaced stars highlighted and connected by lines indicating their new geometric relationships. I've been mapping the new stellar arrangement, Webb continued. The positions aren't random. When you connect the shifted stars, they form a geometric pattern. Specifically, they create a series of angular relationships that don't exist in the natural constellation. Torres felt her stomach tighten. She'd noticed the pattern earlier, but had been reluctant to voice what it implied. The angles between stars now form ratios, Webb went on. Near-perfect ratios. 60-degree separations, 90-degree angles, divisions that suggest deliberate geometric construction. You're saying the stars have been arranged, Mendoza said slowly. Deliberately arranged into a pattern. I'm saying the positional data suggests non-random organisation, Webb replied carefully. Whether that organisation is deliberate or some natural phenomenon we don't understand, I can't say. But everyone on the call understood what wasn't being directly stated. Natural astronomical processes didn't create geometric precision. Stellar positions reflected the chaotic evolution of gas clouds, gravitational interactions, and billions of years of orbital dynamics. They didn't arrange themselves into measured angles and mathematical relationships. We need to report this, the Australian representative said. This goes beyond observational astronomy. If there's even a possibility that these stellar positions have been artificially altered. Artificially? Torres interrupted. By what? By whom? We're talking about stars, objects with masses millions or billions of times greater than Earth. The energy required to move even one star, to physically relocate it across light years, exceeds anything in physics, as we understand it. Maybe they haven't been moved, suggested a younger astronomer from Lucia. Maybe what we're seeing is controlled manipulation of the light reaching us. If something could bend space precisely enough, or create perfect gravitational lenses positioned just right, that would still require technology and energy expenditure far beyond our capabilities, Mendoza countered, and it would require precise knowledge of Earth's position and observational capabilities. It would require targeting us specifically. The word targeting created another moment of heavy silence. Let's stay focused on data, Torres said firmly. Speculation about causes or intentions isn't productive until we have more information. What we need right now is a coordinated observation campaign. continuous monitoring of the affected region, multi-wavelength analysis, and expansion of our survey to determine if this phenomenon is limited to this single zone, or if similar anomalies exist elsewhere in the sky. The conference participants agreed to coordinate their efforts, sharing data in real time through a secure network. They would maintain normal operational security, but flag the observations as requiring priority attention. As the video conference ended and faces disappeared from the screen, Torres turned to Webb. "Do you think anyone's going to believe this?" she asked quietly. Webb looked at the star charts spread across his workspace, at the geometric precision of the shifted constellation, at the evidence that something impossible had occurred. "I think," he said slowly, "that belief won't matter. The data exists. The measurements are reproducible. Whatever this is, it's real. And sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with what that means." Outside the observatory windows, dawn light was washing out the stars, returning the sky to its familiar daytime blue. But both astronomers knew that when darkness returned, the stars would still be wrong. And something, somewhere, would still be watching to see if humanity noticed. The pattern emerges. Over the following 72 hours, the coordinated observation campaign produced an overwhelming volume of data. Observatories across the southern hemisphere focused their instruments on the anomalous sector, capturing images in visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, radio wavelengths, and every other spectrum their equipment could access. Marcus Webb worked nearly around the clock, sleeping in brief intervals between observation windows. Isabella Torres coordinated the data-sharing network, managing communications between facilities and organising the incoming information into coherent, analytical packages. What emerged from the analysis was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The stellar displacement was consistent across all electromagnetic wavelengths. The stars appeared in their new positions, whether observed in visible light or radio emissions. This ruled out certain exotic explanations involving wavelength-specific optical phenomena. More significantly, detailed mapping of the entire affected zone revealed something that sent chills through every astronomer who examined the data. The new stellar arrangement wasn't just geometrically organised, it was mathematically precise. Webb had been the first to notice the angular relationships, but as more sophisticated analysis tools were applied to the data, additional patterns emerged. The displaced stars formed a configuration where the distances between specific objects, when measured in angular separation as viewed from Earth, created ratios that matched fundamental mathematical constants. One trio of stars formed an arrangement where their angular separations approximated pi. Another grouping created distances that related to the golden ratio. A cluster near the centre of the affected zone formed angles that, when measured in specific combinations, produced values close to Euler's number. The precision wasn't perfect, each ratio was accurate within about 2%, but the relationships were far too close to be coincidental. "It's a message," Webb said, during an emergency conference call with the expanded team of astronomers who are now examining the phenomenon. "It has to be. Natural processes don't create mathematical relationships. This is constructed." "Constructed by what?" demanded Rafael Mendoza, frustration evident in his voice. "Even if we accept that some intelligence has done this, and that's an enormous if, we're back to the same impossible question. How? The energy physics alone makes this absurd. Moving stars, bending light across light years with this kind of precision? Maybe they haven't moved the stars, suggested Elena Petrov, a theoretical astrophysicist from Moscow who had joined the investigation. Maybe what we're observing is manipulation of space-time itself on a massive scale. If you could create precisely controlled gravitational fields, micro-lensing effects calibrated to incredible accuracy, you might be able to alter the apparent positions of stars without physically moving them. That's still technology millennia beyond anything we can conceive, Mendoza countered. Exactly, Petrov replied quietly, which tells us something about whoever, or whatever, did this. The call continued for another hour, cycling through the same impossible questions and hypothetical explanations. Finally, Torres suggested they table the theoretical discussion and focus on documentation and analysis. We need to map this completely, she said. Every star in the affected zone, every geometric relationship, every mathematical pattern. If this is a message, we need to understand its full structure before we can hope to interpret its meaning. Over the next week, the astronomical community quietly marshalled resources toward the Centaurus anomaly. The work remained largely undisclosed to the public, not through any conspiratorial suppression, but simply because the astronomers involved wanted to be absolutely certain of their data before making extraordinary claims. Webb took on the role of pattern analyst, spending long hours mapping the geometric and mathematical relationships within the stellar arrangement. He created three-dimensional models showing how the displaced stars related to each other in space, accounting for their actual distances from Earth and their true spatial separation. What he discovered made the phenomenon even more inexplicable. The mathematical patterns existed only when viewed from Earth. When Webb recalculated the stellar positions from other vantage points in the solar system, from Mars, from Jupiter, from hypothetical locations several light years away, the geometric relationships dissolved into apparent randomness. The message, if that's what it was, had been constructed specifically for human observation from our precise location in space. Torres joined Webb in the analysis room late one evening, finding him staring at a holographic projection of the constellation in its new configuration. "It's beautiful," she said softly, despite herself. "It's terrifying," Webb replied. "Do you understand what this means? Whatever created this pattern knew Earth's exact position, knew where we would be observing from, knew our mathematics, our geometry, our fundamental constants. This wasn't aimed at humanity in general, it was aimed at us specifically at this moment in time." Torres pulled up a chair. "Or it's been here a long time, and we're just now noticing it." Webb shook his head. "No, we have continuous photographic records going back over a century. Sky survey missions, satellite observations, amateur astronomy archives. If this pattern existed before 3 months ago, someone would have noticed. The change is recent. Which means someone knows we're here, someone knows we're looking, and someone wants us to see this." They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications. The question wasn't just who, but why. What purpose could be served by rearranging stars into mathematical patterns visible only from Earth? "There's something else," Webb said, pulling up another data set. "I've been analysing the light curves from the displaced stars, looking for any changes in their brightness, spectral characteristics, anything that might give us additional information. And nothing dramatic. The stars themselves appear identical to what they were before. Same luminosity, same spectral signature, same variability patterns. But there's a subtle periodicity in some of the light curves that wasn't there before." Webb displayed a graph showing brightness variations over time for one of the displaced stars. Superimposed on the star's normal variation pattern was a faint, regular oscillation. The period is approximately 231 seconds, Webb explained. It's present in 6 of the displaced stars, always with the same period. Torres studied the graph. That's oddly specific, not a round number. No, but it is mathematically significant. 231 is the result of 3 times 7 times 11, Torres finished, her eyes widening. Prime factorization, Webb nodded. A product of prime numbers. Another mathematical signal embedded in an already mathematical message. What do we do with this information? Torres asked. Webb leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. I don't know. We document it, we analyse it, we try to understand it, but ultimately, he gestured at the star pattern rotating slowly in the holographic display. It's impossible geometry, defying everything they thought they knew about the universe. Ultimately, I think we wait, because whatever intelligence created this went to enormous effort to get our attention, which means they probably have more to say. Radio signal correlation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While optical astronomers continued mapping the geometric patterns in the displaced constellation, radio astronomers at the Parkes Observatory in Australia were conducting their own survey of the affected region. They were searching for any radio emissions that might provide additional clues about the nature of the phenomenon. What they found changed everything. 8 days after the initial discovery, Parkes detected faint radio signals emanating from the Centaurus region. The signals were extremely weak, barely above the noise threshold, but their artificial character was unmistakable. They consisted of regular pulses occurring in precise intervals, a pattern that natural astronomical radio sources didn't produce. The discovery was reported to the International Coordination Network, and within hours, other radio facilities confirmed the detection. The signals were real, reproducible, and emanated from the same zone of sky where the stellar positions had shifted. Marcus Webb was in the Atacama cafeteria, forcing down his first real meal in 2 days, when Isabella Torres found him with the news. The radio astronomers picked up something, she said without preamble. Artificial signals from the constellation. Webb forgot his food immediately. They rushed back to the observation centre, where Torres had already pulled up the preliminary data from Parkes. The radio signal was structured as a series of pulses, short bursts of emission, followed by silence, repeated in a regular pattern. The pulse duration was consistent, approximately 0.3 seconds, with intervals between pulses varying in a specific sequence. It's not random, Webb observed, studying the timing data. The intervals follow a pattern. Torres pulled up an analysis program and began processing the signal structure. Within minutes, the pattern became clear. The intervals between pulses corresponded to sequential prime numbers: 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 11 seconds. The sequence continued through the first 20 prime numbers before repeating. Another mathematical message, Torres said. They're really hammering the point home. They want to make absolutely sure we recognise this as artificial, Webb agreed. Natural phenomena don't broadcast prime number sequences. But the signals revealed something even more intriguing when examined in detail. The radio emissions didn't originate from the stars themselves. They came from the space between them, specifically from points in space that formed additional geometric nodes when connected to the displaced stellar positions. It's like the stars are markers, Webb realised, pulling up a 3-dimensional visualisation. The displaced stars define points in space, and the radio sources create additional reference points. Together, they form a larger geometric structure. Torres enhanced the visualisation, adding the radio source positions to the stellar map. The result was striking. a three-dimensional polyhedron outlined by the combination of optical and radio markers with mathematical precision in its proportions and angles. "What is this?" Torres whispered. "A diagram? A coordinate system? A map? Or a greeting card?" Webb suggested. "A way of saying, we know you're there. We know you're intelligent enough to recognize patterns, and we have things to show you." Over the following days, radio observatories across the globe focused their attention on the Centaurus region, conducting detailed surveys to map every source of artificial emission. What they discovered was a complex communication network. The radio signals didn't transmit continuously. They activated only when terrestrial telescopes focused on the region. The correlation was consistent and precise. Point a telescope at the affected sector of sky, and within seconds, the radio emissions would begin. Look away, and after approximately 1 minute, the signals would cease. The implication was staggering. Whatever intelligence had created the stellar pattern was actively monitoring human astronomical observations. They knew when we were looking. They responded to our attention. "How is that possible?" Webb asked during an emergency conference call with the expanded research team, which now included radio astronomers, signal processing experts, and even representatives from space agencies. How could they know when our telescopes are pointed at that specific region? The distances involved, the light travel time, none of this makes sense. "Unless they're not reacting in real time," suggested Elena Petrov. "What if the signals are programmed to respond to certain electromagnetic signatures? Our telescopes emit characteristic radiation patterns when they operate. Power systems, electronic noise, even just waste heat. If you had sufficiently sensitive detection equipment positioned close enough to Earth, you might be able to detect when a telescope is pointing in a specific direction." "Close enough to Earth?" Mendoza echoed. "You're suggesting there's something in our solar system? Something monitoring us?" "I'm suggesting," Petrov replied carefully, "that attempting to communicate across light years by modulating starlight and radio emissions implies a level of technological sophistication that wouldn't be challenged by the engineering requirements of remote monitoring." The call descended into speculation about observation platforms, autonomous monitoring systems, and the unsettling possibility that humanity was under active surveillance. But Torres brought the discussion back to empirical observation. "Speculation aside, we have an opportunity here. If the signals respond to our observations, we can potentially interact with them. We could try introducing variations in our observation patterns and see if the signals adapt." The proposal sparked immediate interest. Over the next week, astronomers conducted what amounted to the first intentional two-way communication experiment with whatever intelligence lay behind the phenomenon. They tried varying observation duration, looking at the constellation for precisely measured intervals. The radio signals adapted, transmitting for corresponding lengths of time. They tried pointing multiple telescopes at the region simultaneously. The signal strength increased proportionally, as if responding to multiple observers. They tried introducing patterns in their observation schedule, looking for specific durations in sequence, creating their own mathematical progressions. The radio signals echoed back similar patterns, confirming reception and understanding. "They're responding," Webb said, watching real-time data from the latest observation sequence. "They know we're trying to communicate. They're acknowledging our attempts." Torres felt a mix of excitement and dread. "What does this mean? What do we do now?" "We keep documenting," Webb replied. "We keep analysing, and we prepare for whatever comes next. Because this, all of this, is clearly a prelude. The constellation shift got our attention. The mathematical patterns proved intelligence. The radio signals confirmed communication capability. This is building toward something. Toward what? Webb stared at the monitors, at the impossible constellation, at the responsive radio signals that suggested vast and incomprehensible intelligence watching from the darkness between stars. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think we'll have to wait much longer to find out." The motion event. The active phase began on the 43rd day after the initial discovery. Marcus Webb was conducting a routine observation sequence, maintaining the systematic documentation protocol that had been established for monitoring the constellation. It was just past midnight local time. Conditions were excellent, and the affected region was at optimal elevation for observation. He had the telescope fixed on the central area of the displaced constellation, capturing long exposure images while simultaneously monitoring radio emissions from the region. Everything appeared normal, or as normal as an impossible stellar phenomenon could be. Then one of the stars moved. At first, Webb thought he was hallucinating from exhaustion. He'd been working grueling hours for over a month, and fatigue could create all sorts of perceptual artifacts. But the monitoring software registered it too, a positional change in one of the displaced stars occurring in real time as he watched. The star didn't streak across the sky like a meteor. It didn't flash or brighten or display any of the dramatic characteristics one might expect from a moving object. It simply repositioned, gliding smoothly from one location to another over the course of approximately 40 seconds. The displacement was small, only about 0.2 degrees, but it was absolutely unmistakable on the tracking display. The star moved perpendicular to the direction of Earth's rotation, ruling out any artifact of telescope tracking error. Webb's hands shook as he immediately activated the recording protocols, capturing multi-wavelength data on the event. He simultaneously sent an alert to the observation network, flagging the occurrence as priority 1. Within minutes, observatories across the network were redirecting their instruments to the coordinates. They confirmed what Webb had seen. A star had moved, and it was still moving. The object continued its deliberate repositioning, maintaining a constant angular velocity that suggested controlled motion rather than ballistic trajectory or gravitational deflection. Over the next 3 minutes, it travelled a total angular distance of approximately 0.5 degrees, before coming to a complete stop at what appeared to be a precisely defined location. Isabella Torres reached the observation centre 15 minutes after receiving Webb's alert. She found him pale and shaken, staring at replayed footage of the motion event. "Tell me this is real," she said. Webb replayed the sequence. The star's motion was smooth, continuous, and absolutely impossible by every physical principle they understood. "I don't know what's real anymore," he admitted, "but every instrument we have says this happened. A star moved, not appeared to move, actually moved, changing its position on the sky in a way that can't be explained by Earth's rotation, atmospheric effects, or instrumental artifacts." Torres examined the data herself, running through the same diagnostic checks Webb had already performed. The evidence was undeniable. Something that appeared to be a star, an object bright enough and spectroscopically consistent with a stellar source, had changed position in a manner that violated everything they knew about how celestial objects behaved. "What's the radio signal doing?" she asked. Webb pulled up the radio telescope data. The emissions from the region had intensified during the motion event, becoming nearly 10 times stronger than baseline. The signal structure had also changed, becoming more complex, carrying what appeared to be additional information encoded in variations of pulse duration and intensity. "They're saying something," Webb said. "During the movement, they're broadcasting something more sophisticated than the prime number sequence. Look at this. There's structured modulation here, complexity that suggests actual information content rather than just a recognition signal." Torres studied the waveform. The pattern was intricate but clearly non-random. "We need linguists, information theorists. If this is a message, it's beyond our expertise to decode." The motion event triggered a dramatic escalation in the investigation. Word of the occurrence spread rapidly through the astronomical community, and within 48 hours, the discovery could no longer be contained within the small network of coordinating observatories. Governments became involved. Space agencies requested access to the data. Defense departments expressed concern about potential security implications. The phenomenon that had begun as an intriguing astronomical anomaly had transformed into something that demanded institutional response. But the astronomers who had been monitoring the constellation from the beginning maintained their coordinated observation protocol, documenting everything with scientific rigour, even as external pressure and scrutiny increased. And 3 days after the first motion event, it happened again. A different star in the constellation moved, following the same pattern, smooth controlled displacement over several minutes, travelling to a new position before stopping precisely. Then another star moved the following night, and another 2 nights after that. Over the course of 2 weeks, 7 different objects within the constellation performed deliberate repositioning manoeuvres. Each movement was recorded by multiple facilities. Each generated intense radio emissions during the motion phase. Each concluded with the object settling into a new, geometrically significant position. Webb worked obsessively to map the new configuration taking shape. The stars weren't moving randomly. They were arranging themselves into an even more complex geometric pattern than before. The new positions created additional mathematical relationships, more elaborate polyhedra when mapped in 3 dimensions, increasingly sophisticated messages encoded in angular separations and spatial arrangements. "They're building something," he told Torres during one of their increasingly rare breaks. "Or drawing something. Each movement adds more complexity to the structure. It's like watching someone sketch a picture, one line at a time, except they're using stars as their medium and the entire visible universe as their canvas." "What's the end point?" Torres asked. "What's the final picture going to show?" Webb displayed his latest projection, extrapolating based on the pattern of movements and the geometric relationships being established. If they continue the progression, if the pattern holds, the final configuration will create a 3-dimensional structure that, when viewed from Earth, forms a coherent geometric solid. Specifically, he rotated the projection, showing the pattern from different angles. It will form a compound polyhedron with properties that match what we call a Kepler-Poinsot star, a mathematical object that's been known since the Renaissance but has never been observed occurring naturally in spatial arrangements of astronomical objects. And the significance is that it's impossible. You can't have stars naturally arranged in these positions. The structure requires precise positioning across dozens of light years of actual spatial separation. It requires coordination, intention, design. Torres looked at the projection, at the mathematical perfection being assembled star by star in the actual sky above them. "How long?" she asked. "How long until the pattern is complete?" Webb checked his calculations. Based on the rate of movements and the remaining stars that would need to reposition to complete the structure, approximately 3 weeks. Maybe less if the movement rate accelerates. And And then, Webb said quietly, we find out what happens when someone finishes leaving us a message written in starlight. The scale realization. As the stellar rearrangement continued over the following weeks, physicists and astrophysicists attempted to calculate the implications of what was occurring. The numbers they derived were nothing short of terrifying. Elena Petrov led the effort to understand the scale of engineering involved in the phenomenon. She assembled a team of specialists in gravitational physics, stellar dynamics, and energy physics to model the requirements for moving star-sized objects, or creating the illusion of moving them. The report they produced made for disturbing reading. If the stars were being physically moved through space, actually relocated from one point to another, the energy requirements were astronomical in the most literal sense. Moving a star like Alpha Centauri, with a mass approximately 1.1 times that of our Sun, across even a fraction of a light year, would require energy output equivalent to the entire electromagnetic emissions of a galaxy for years. The propulsion systems needed to achieve such movement without destroying the star itself would need to manipulate gravitational fields on scales humanity couldn't even theoretically model. You would need to effectively turn the laws of physics into engineering tools, treating space-time as a malleable medium that could be shaped and controlled. The alternative, Petrov explained during a comprehensive briefing to the expanded research team, is that they're not moving the stars at all. They're manipulating how we perceive them, either by creating incredibly precise gravitational lensing effects that bend starlight exactly as needed, or by some other means of controlling electromagnetic radiation across light years of space. That's still impossibly advanced technology, Mendoza objected. Yes, Petrov agreed, but it's orders of magnitude less impossible than physically moving stars. Instead of manipulating stellar mass objects, you're manipulating light. You're creating what amounts to a sophisticated optical illusion, but on a cosmic scale. Marcus Webb had been following the theoretical work closely. One aspect particularly troubled him. Even if they're just manipulating light, he said, the precision required is staggering. They're not just bending starlight randomly, they're controlling exactly how it appears from Earth's perspective. That requires knowing our exact position in space and time. Not just knowing it, Torres added, predicting it. The light we're seeing from those stars left them years ago. Alpha Centauri's light takes 4.37 years to reach us. If someone wanted to create an artificial image by manipulating that light, they'd need to have positioned whatever lensing or beam directing technology they're using years in advance, accounting for Earth's future position in its orbit, the solar system's motion through the galaxy, everything. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They've been watching us for years, Webb said quietly, planning this, positioning whatever apparatus they need, accounting for our motion, our observation capabilities, our level of technological development. This wasn't a spontaneous communication attempt. This was carefully orchestrated, probably over a time scale we can barely comprehend. The scale realization prompted intense debate about how to interpret the phenomenon. If the intelligence behind the stellar display possessed technology capable of manipulating stars or starlight across light years of space with mathematical precision, what did that suggest about their capabilities in other domains? Could they manipulate matter on Earth with similar precision? Could they affect our sun, our planet, our bodies? Were the stellar movements a demonstration of power, a warning, an offer, a test? The question that haunted Webb most was, why use stars at all? Any civilization with such advanced technology could communicate through countless other means. They could broadcast radio signals that would be obvious and unmistakable. They could send probes to our solar system. If they wanted contact, why choose the most elaborate, energy-intensive method imaginable? Unless the elaborateness itself was the point. It's a capability demonstration, Webb suggested, during a late-night discussion with Torres. They're not just saying, we exist. They're saying, look what we can do. Moving stars is deliberately excessive. It's meant to inspire awe, maybe fear. It's meant to establish a power dynamic before any real communication begins. Or, Torres countered, it's meant to ensure we take them seriously. If they just sent radio signals, we might dismiss them as natural phenomena or hoaxes. By doing something obviously impossible, something that requires technology millennia beyond ours, they guarantee we'll pay attention. They guarantee we'll understand we're dealing with intelligence far superior to our own. Both interpretations were unsettling, implying careful consideration of human psychology by an intelligence that shouldn't have any way of understanding how humans thought. The stellar movements continued on schedule. Each repositioning was captured by dozens of observatories, analysed by hundreds of scientists, and discussed in increasingly anxious briefings with government officials who were trying to formulate policy for a situation that had no precedent. Webb maintained his geometric analysis, tracking each movement and mapping the evolving structure. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, a three-dimensional mathematical object taking shape in the sky, visible only from Earth, constructed with precision that proved beyond any doubt that this was intentional design. 49 days after the first stellar displacement was observed, 63 days after the constellation was first noticed to have changed, the final star moved into position. The pattern was complete. Observatories worldwide captured the moment, documenting the final stellar arrangement in every wavelength accessible to their instruments. The constellation now formed a perfect geometric structure, a compound polyhedron whose vertices were defined by the displaced stars, whose edges were suggested by the geometric relationships between them, and whose message was absolutely clear. This was not nature, this was not accident, this was construction, art, mathematics made manifest in the arrangement of suns. Webb stared at the completed pattern on his monitor, feeling simultaneously awed and terrified. "Now what?" he whispered to the empty observation room. As if in answer, the radio signals from the constellation changed. The simple pulse patterns gave way to a complex transmission, structured, information-dense, clearly encoded data flowing from the geometric pattern in the sky. The message they had been waiting for had arrived, and humanity, whether ready or not, would have to find a way to understand it. The observatory shut down. The completion of the stellar pattern and the subsequent complex radio transmission triggered immediate responses from governmental and military institutions across the globe. What had been primarily a scientific investigation suddenly became a matter of national and international security. 3 days after the pattern's completion, Isabella Torres received a formal notification from Chilean government representatives. The Atacama facility was being placed under temporary administrative oversight. Access would be restricted to essential personnel, and all data related to the constellation phenomenon would be subject to security review before public dissemination. Similar restrictions were implemented at observatories worldwide. The Australian National Observatory received visitors from Defence Intelligence. South African facilities were placed under research coordination protocols that limited their operational independence. Even institutions in countries not typically prone to information control found themselves subject to unusual governmental interest. Marcus Webb watched with frustration as the open, collaborative network that had characterized the investigation's early weeks began to fragment under institutional pressure. Data sharing became restricted. Conference calls required security clearances. The scientific pursuit of understanding was being subordinated to political concerns about information control and strategic implications. "They're shutting us down," he told Torres angrily. "Not officially, not overtly, but effectively. They're wrapping everything in classification and oversight until we can barely communicate between facilities, let alone conduct coordinated research." Torres understood his frustration, but also recognized the political reality. An intelligence that can manipulate stars is being interpreted as a potential security threat. Governments want to control the narrative, manage public response, and maintain strategic advantage if this turns into some kind of contact scenario. Strategic advantage? Webb laughed bitterly. Against who? Against what? If they can move stars or make them appear to move, what possible strategic advantage could any government maintain? The scale disparity is absurd. But institutional momentum was difficult to resist. Within 2 weeks of the pattern's completion, most major observatories involved in the investigation had been visited by government representatives. The official stance was one of coordination and security review, but the practical effect was a dramatic reduction in open scientific discussion. More troubling was what began happening to the public data. Astronomical databases and star catalogues began being quietly updated. The Centaurus region entries were modified to reflect corrected coordinates that matched the current observed positions. No announcements were made, no explanations were offered, but gradually the official record was being altered to erase the evidence that the stars had ever been in different positions. Webb discovered this when he attempted to access archived data for a comparative analysis and found that several online databases had been updated to reflect the new stellar positions as if they had always been that way. "They're rewriting history," he said incredulously. "They're literally changing the astronomical record to pretend this never happened." Torres had received unofficial explanations from colleagues in other facilities. The rationale is public stability. There are concerns about how people would react to confirmed evidence of intelligence capable of stellar manipulation. The decision was made to delay public disclosure until there's better understanding of the phenomenon's implications. "That's not science," Webb protested. "That's information control. That's the kind of thing that breeds conspiracy theories and public distrust." "I know, but we're not in control anymore. The decision-making has moved to levels well above observatory directors and research coordinators." Despite the restrictions, Webb and several other astronomers in the original research network maintained unofficial communication channels. They continued analysing the data they had already collected, particularly the complex radio transmission that had begun when the stellar pattern completed. The transmission was fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. It clearly contained structured information, repeating sequences, hierarchical organisation, markers that suggested distinct sections or chapters of data. But the encoding remained opaque. Without understanding the fundamental symbology or mathematical basis of the communication protocol, decoding the actual content was extraordinarily difficult. Various research teams tried different approaches. Some attempted linguistic analysis, searching for patterns that might suggest grammatical structures. Others focused on mathematical interpretation, looking for equations or geometric descriptions encoded in the signal variations. Still others pursued information theoretic analysis, trying to understand the signal's fundamental structure without assuming anything about its content. Progress was slow and uncertain. The transmission continued for 3 weeks after the pattern completion, broadcasting continuously at high intensity. Then, as suddenly as it had become complex, the signal reverted to the simple prime number sequence that had characterized the early contact phase. The elaborate message had been delivered. Now, apparently, the intelligence behind it was waiting to see if humanity could understand. Webb spent sleepless nights working on the decoding problem, driven by the conviction that understanding the message was crucial to understanding the intentions behind the entire phenomenon. But he was increasingly isolated in this work, cut off from many of the resources and collaborative networks that had supported the earlier investigation. It was during one of these solitary sessions, 3 months after the initial constellation shift, that Webb made a disturbing discovery. He had been reviewing archived images from the facility's long-term sky survey program, checking whether any earlier anomalies had been missed. What he found was subtle but unmistakable. Going back through years of archived data, he discovered that the constellation had not changed all at once 3 months ago. It had been changing gradually, incrementally, over a period of at least 2 years. The shifts had been tiny, small fractions of a degree, occurring in irregular intervals, never more than 1 or 2 stars changing position at any given time. The movements had been so subtle, so gradual, that they had fallen below the threshold of normal observational attention. No individual image showed obvious discontinuity with previous observations because the changes were designed to be just barely undetectable. Only when Webb compiled a long-term sequence and explicitly looked for positional drift did the pattern become clear. The constellation had been systematically rearranged over an extended period, with the dramatic acceleration and completion occurring only in the final months. They've been working on this for years, Webb realised with a chill. Planning it, implementing it gradually, adjusting stellar positions bit by bit. The recent rapid movements weren't the beginning. They were the finale, the finishing touches on a project that's been underway longer than we knew to look for it. He tried to share this finding with Torres and other colleagues, but by this point, official interest in the constellation had begun to wane. The phenomenon had become normalized. The stars were where they were. The radio signals had reverted to simple patterns. Governments had established protocols for monitoring the situation, and attention had shifted to other priorities. The message humanity had been sent was sitting in databases and archives, encoded in radio signals and stellar positions waiting to be understood. But the institutional momentum for understanding it had dissipated under the combined pressures of security concerns, public management, and simple human tendency to adapt to even the most extraordinary circumstances. Webb felt the weight of this failure acutely. Something momentous had occurred, perhaps the most significant event in human history, and the response had been bureaucratic containment and gradual indifference. He continued his work alone, maintaining his personal archive of uncorrupted data, documenting everything with the meticulousness that had characterized his career. He couldn't decode the message. He couldn't understand. He'd saw none of the intelligence behind it, but he could preserve the evidence that it had happened, ensure that someone someday might be able to make sense of what the stars had tried to tell humanity. The astronomer's hidden archive. In the following months, as institutional interest in the constellation phenomenon continued to wane and official databases underwent their quiet revisions, Marcus Webb became increasingly concerned about the preservation of accurate historical data. He had watched with alarm as astronomical catalogues were updated, as archived images in public databases were replaced with corrected versions, as the paper trail documenting the original stellar positions gradually disappeared from official sources. The revisions were never acknowledged openly. No press releases announced the database updates. No scientific papers formally documented the coordinate changes. The modifications simply appeared, usually attributed to improved measurement techniques or calibration corrections, when they were attributed to anything at all. Webb understood the mechanism at work. Most astronomical data was stored digitally, and digital records could be altered without leaving obvious traces. Physical photographic plates and paper records were gradually being retired as institutions digitized their archives, and the digitization process provided opportunities for substitution. He decided to create an independent archive, a comprehensive record of the constellation's true history that couldn't be quietly erased. Working carefully to avoid triggering institutional oversight, Webb began assembling his collection. He copied raw observational data from the Atacama facility's servers before it could be modified, making bit-perfect duplicates that included digital signatures and timestamps. He photographed physical photographic plates, creating high-resolution images that showed the stars in their original positions. He compiled reports, communications, and analysis documents from the early weeks of the investigation, before security restrictions had fragmented the research network. Most importantly, he preserved the sequence of images showing the gradual stellar movements, documenting not just the dramatic repositioning events, but also the subtle, years-long process that had preceded them. Webb stored this archive across multiple formats and locations: encrypted hard drives hidden in personal storage, optical discs buried in protective cases, cloud storage accounts registered under aliases, even old-fashioned printed documents, bound and filed in locations known only to him. It was paranoid behaviour, he recognised, but paranoia felt appropriate when dealing with evidence of cosmic-scale intelligence being systematically erased from official records. Isabella Torres knew about the archive, though she'd been careful not to ask too many details that might compromise her position at the observatory. She tacitly supported Webb's preservation efforts, occasionally providing access to data or resources that might otherwise have been difficult to obtain. "You're building a time capsule," she told him, during one of their increasingly infrequent private conversations. "Evidence for future generations who might be more ready to deal with this than we are. Or evidence for present-day people who deserve to know what happened," Webb replied. "The institutional response to this has been to suppress and normalise. Someone needs to maintain the actual truth." The archive wasn't just a collection of raw data. Webb spent countless hours organising and annotating it, creating detailed analyses of the stellar movements, geometric patterns, and radio transmissions. He documented his decoding attempts, even though most had failed. He included theoretical papers from Petrov and others examining the physics implications of the phenomenon. Most significantly, he performed frame-by-frame analysis of the complete sequence of stellar movements, from the earliest subtle shifts through to the dramatic final positioning events. What this analysis revealed was even more elaborate than Webb had initially realised. The stellar rearrangement hadn't just created a single geometric pattern visible at one moment in time. It had created a sequence of patterns, a progression of geometric configurations that evolved as stars moved from their original positions to their final ones. When Webb animated the movement sequence, playing back the months-long process of stellar repositioning, he could see distinct phases in the pattern's development. Early stages created simple geometric relationships, basic triangular and quadrilateral arrangements. Middle stages built more complex polyhedra. Final stages assembled the ultimate compound structure. Each phase had its own internal mathematical coherence, as if the intelligence behind the phenomenon had deliberately created intermediate messages along the path to the final configuration. It was like watching someone write a book, where each chapter was complete and meaningful on its own, but all chapters contributed to a larger narrative. Webb attempted to interpret these intermediate patterns. Some seem to reference fundamental physical constants, ratios that approximated the fine structure. Constant, the gravitational constant, the ratio between electron and proton masses. Others suggested spatial relationships or coordinate systems that might relate to local galactic geography. The final configuration, the completed pattern that had generated so much attention before being normalized away, appeared to Webb to be less a message and more a signature, a way of identifying the source or nature of the intelligence communicating. The geometric solid formed by the final stellar positions had properties that were mathematically unique. It was a specific type of compound polyhedron, one whose existence had been theoretically predicted, but which had never been observed in natural or artificial structures. Creating it required precise positioning of elements in three-dimensional space, according to very specific rules. Someone had inscribed a mathematical signature in the sky, a proof of their identity or nature that anyone with sufficient geometric knowledge could recognize. But who or what? The signature proved intelligence and capability, but didn't reveal origin or intention. Webb compiled all these findings into a comprehensive document he titled the Centaurus Manuscript, a detailed accounting of everything observed, measured, and analysed during the constellation phenomenon. The manuscript ran to over 400 pages, including thousands of images, data tables, and analytical graphs. He made multiple copies, encrypting them with keys he distributed to trusted colleagues through secure channels. He arranged for delayed release versions to be published in the event of his death or disappearance. He sent summary versions to journalists, though most showed limited interest in a technical document about astronomical events they'd been told were measurement errors. The archive and manuscript became Webb's obsession, his way of ensuring that this moment in human history would not be forgotten, even if institutional forces wanted it erased. Late one night, working alone in the observation centre, long after his official shift had ended, Webb compiled a final addendum to the manuscript. It was a personal reflection rather than scientific analysis, his attempt to articulate what the constellation phenomenon meant to him on a human level. "We have been shown," he wrote, "that we are observed, that our presence in the universe has not gone unnoticed, that somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, intelligence exists with capabilities far beyond our own. This intelligence made an effort, an extraordinary, elaborate effort, to communicate with us, to demonstrate its existence in a way we could not dismiss or ignore. The fact that our institutional response has been to suppress and normalise this contact is perhaps revealing of humanity's readiness for cosmic perspective. We are still in many ways a provincial species, uncomfortable with implications that challenge our sense of primacy or control. But the evidence exists, the stars moved, the patterns were created, the message was transmitted. Whether we choose to acknowledge it officially or not, the contact occurred, and that changes everything, even if we pretend it doesn't. Someone is out there, someone is watching, someone wanted us to know they exist. What we do with that knowledge, whether we rise to meet this cosmic moment or retreat into comfortable denial, will say much about who we are as a species. Webb saved the addendum, backed it up across his distributed archive network, and sat in the quiet observation centre, listening to the hum of equipment and the whisper of ventilation systems. Above him, beyond the dome, the constellation hung in its new configuration. Stars burning in positions they shouldn't occupy, encoding messages humanity wasn't quite ready to receive. The evidence was preserved. The record was maintained. Someday, perhaps, someone would be ready to understand what it meant. The communication hypothesis. Despite institutional suppression and public indifference, a small network of researchers continued analysing the constellation phenomenon. They operated semi-independently, sharing findings through encrypted channels and informal communications, maintaining the scientific investigation that official bodies had abandoned. Elena Petrov remained one of the most active members of this underground research network. From her position at a Moscow institute, she continued theoretical work on the physics of what they'd observed, gradually developing a comprehensive framework for understanding the phenomenon. 6 months after the pattern's completion, she published a paper through an obscure academic journal that most mainstream publications had rejected. The paper was titled Stellar Scale Communication and the Observer's Hypothesis. Marcus Webb read it late one evening, finding in Petrov's careful analysis an articulation of ideas he'd been grappling with for months. Petrov's central argument was elegant and disturbing. The constellation phenomenon was not primarily a message. It was an announcement of observation capability. Consider, she wrote, what it means to rearrange stars in patterns visible specifically from Earth. This requires precise knowledge of our position in space and time. It requires understanding our observational capabilities and our level of technological development. Most significantly, it requires continuous monitoring to ensure the patterns remain correctly aligned despite Earth's motion through space. The stars themselves are not the message, they are the medium demonstrating that we are being watched. The true communication is not the geometric patterns we see, but the fact that those patterns exist at all. Someone is telling us, we know you're there, we know where you are, we can manipulate your sky with precision that accounts for your exact vantage point. We are observing you constantly. The paper went on to analyse the radio signals that accompanied the stellar display. Petrov argued that the complex transmission wasn't meant to convey specific information in the conventional sense. Rather, it was a protocol demonstration, a proof that bi-directional communication was possible, that the intelligence behind the phenomenon could both send and potentially receive signals. The radio transmission, Petrov explained, exhibits characteristics consistent with a communication framework rather than a specific message. It establishes encoding structures, demonstrates information hierarchies, and provides what appear to be synchronization markers, all elements of a protocol rather than content. It's as if someone is saying, this is how we communicate, rather than this is what we want to tell you. Webb found this interpretation both compelling and chilling. If Petrov was correct, the entire elaborate display had been a capability demonstration, a way of proving that direct, intentional, continuous observation of Earth was occurring, and that whoever was watching possessed technology capable of cosmic scale manipulation. The question was, Why demonstrate this capability now? The research network debated this question intensely. Some argued it represented first contact, the opening move in what would become an ongoing communication effort. Others suggested it was a warning, a demonstration of power meant to establish parameters before more direct interaction. Rafael Mendoza, still active in the research network, despite increasing restrictions at his home institution, proposed a different interpretation in a response paper. He suggested the constellation phenomenon might be a test, specifically a test of humanity's scientific maturity and social readiness for contact. An advanced intelligence, Mendoza wrote, might reasonably want to assess a species' development level before initiating direct communication. The constellation display does exactly that. It requires sophisticated astronomical observation to notice, mathematical knowledge to recognize the geometric patterns, and physical understanding to appreciate the impossibility of what's occurring. Any species that can detect and analyze this phenomenon has demonstrated minimum threshold capabilities for meaningful contact. More interestingly, the intelligence's response to our investigation might have been diagnostic. How did humanity react? Did we recognize the artificial nature of the patterns? Did we attempt communication? Did we suppress the information or share it openly? Our actual response, institutional suppression, fragmented research efforts, and limited public disclosure, may have provided the observers with considerable information about our current social and political maturity. This suggestion troubled Webb deeply. If Mendoza was right, humanity might have failed whatever test the constellation phenomenon represented. Instead of demonstrating scientific openness and collaborative curiosity, we'd shown political fragmentation, information control, and institutional inertia. Perhaps that failure explained why, after the initial dramatic period of stellar movements and complex radio transmissions, the phenomenon had subsided into a quiet maintenance mode. The stars remained in their new positions, the radio signals continued their simple pulse patterns, but nothing new had emerged. Maybe humanity had been given an opportunity and had proven unready to take it. Isabella Torres offered a more optimistic interpretation during one of her conversations with Webb. Maybe the test isn't over. Maybe the observation is ongoing. They've established that we noticed, that we can recognize patterns, that we attempted communication. Now they're waiting to see if we'll take the next step, whatever that step is. What would that next step be? Webb asked. I don't know. Attempting more sophisticated communication? Sending signals back? Preparing for more direct contact? Maybe they're patient. Maybe they measure time on scales we can barely comprehend. And to them, waiting a few years or decades for humanity to develop further is insignificant. Webb wanted to believe this interpretation, but he was troubled by the trajectory he'd observed over the past months. Rather than building toward greater understanding, humanity's response to the constellation phenomenon had been characterized by declining interest, institutional suppression, and eventual normalization. The general public barely knew anything had happened. Occasional reports about astronomical anomalies had appeared in mainstream media, but they'd been treated as curiosities rather than potential evidence of contact. The official position from space agencies and scientific institutions remained that the phenomenon was related to improved measurement techniques and calibration corrections. Within astronomy itself, the community had split. Older, more institutionally embedded researchers generally accepted or promoted the official narrative. Younger astronomers, particularly those who had been part of the early investigation, maintained their conviction that something extraordinary had occurred, but found it increasingly difficult to pursue research on the topic without jeopardizing their careers. The phenomenon was being actively forgotten, even as the evidence of its existence continued glowing in the night sky. Webb and his network continued their work regardless. They maintained observational protocols, monitoring the constellation for any changes. They attempted various forms of response communication, broadcasting radio signals toward the pattern using privately accessible transmitters, trying different encoding schemes and mathematical sequences in hopes of eliciting a reply. No response came. The stars remained in their impossible positions. The radio signals maintained their simple pulse pattern, and humanity, whether by choice or incapacity, seemed unable to engage meaningfully with the cosmic intelligence that had so deliberately announced its presence. 1 year after the initial discovery, Webb stood in the Atacama Observation Center late at night, looking at the familiar display of the constellation on his monitor. He'd spent the past 12 months documenting, analysing, and attempting to understand this phenomenon. He had preserved evidence that others wanted erased. He had maintained scientific rigour even as institutional support evaporated, and yet he was no closer to understanding what it all meant. The stars burned in their geometric arrangement, proof of intelligence and intention beyond human comprehension. The message remained encoded, waiting for someone clever enough or patient enough to decode it. The observers, whoever or whatever they were, continued their silent watch. Webb felt the profound loneliness of being one of the few who still paid attention, who still believed this mattered, who still thought humanity should be trying harder to rise to this cosmic moment. But he continued his work. He maintained his archive. He watched the sky, because somewhere in that arrangement of impossible starlight, answers existed, and giving up the search for those answers felt like surrendering humanity's only chance to meet this moment with the dignity and curiosity it deserved. The sky that watches back. 18 months after the constellation first shifted, life had largely returned to normal for most people. The astronomical anomaly, to the extent it was remembered at all, had been relegated to the same category as other unexplained phenomena that briefly captured public attention before being absorbed into the background noise of modern existence. Marcus Webb no longer worked at the Atacama facility. His increasingly vocal skepticism about the official narrative, combined with his refusal to discontinue unauthorized research on the constellation, had resulted in a mutual agreement for him to pursue other opportunities. He now taught astronomy at a regional university, maintaining his observation protocols in his personal time using a modest backyard telescope. Isabella Torres remained at Atacama, having made the pragmatic choice to accept institutional constraints in exchange for continued access to professional-grade equipment. She and Webb remained in contact, though their conversations had taken on the bittersweet quality of two people who'd witnessed something extraordinary together but had been forced onto different paths. The underground research network continued, though it had dwindled to perhaps 24 active participants worldwide. They shared observations through encrypted channels, maintained distributed archives of uncorrupted data, and continued attempting to decode the radio transmissions that still pulsed in prime number sequences from the Centaurus region. Then on a cool evening in early autumn, the constellation changed again. Webb was conducting his nightly observation routine when he noticed the first shift. One of the outer stars in the pattern began moving, following the same deliberate, controlled motion that had characterized the movements 18 months earlier. He immediately alerted the network. Within hours, telescopes across the southern hemisphere confirmed what he was seeing. The constellation was being rearranged again. Over the following 3 weeks, stars repositioned themselves in a coordinated sequence. But this time, the movement wasn't building toward greater complexity. It was simplifying. The elaborate geometric structure that had been so carefully constructed was being systematically dismantled. One by one, stars moved back toward their original positions, the positions they had occupied according to pre-anomaly catalogues. The compound polyhedron dissolved. The mathematical relationships encoded in angular separations disappeared. The signature that had been written across light years of space was being erased. Webb watched with a complex mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindication. Here was undeniable proof that the original movements had been real, that something extraordinary had occurred, that he hadn't been documenting imaginary patterns or measurement artifacts. But larger than vindication was a profound sense of loss. The constellation was being restored to its natural configuration. The message was being withdrawn. The demonstration of observational capability and cosmic scale engineering was being deliberately undone. "They're leaving," he said to Torres during a video call, watching real-time data showing another star sliding back into its pre-contact position. Or at least, they're removing the evidence of their presence. "Why?" Torres asked. "Why go to such elaborate effort to establish contact, only to erase it 18 months later?" Webb had been thinking about this question for weeks, ever since the reversal began. Maybe because we failed to respond adequately. Maybe because they concluded we weren't ready. Or maybe, he paused, considering an idea that had been forming gradually in his mind. Maybe the contact was always meant to be temporary. A probe, a survey. They gathered whatever information they wanted, and now they're moving on. The radio signals had changed too, becoming more complex during the stellar reversal process. The research network attempted comprehensive recording and analysis, racing against time to capture every detail before the phenomenon ended. Elena Petrov coordinated a final analytical push, assembling the network's combined expertise to interpret the signals accompanying the constellation's return to normal. Their conclusion, published in the same obscure journal that had hosted Petrov's earlier paper, was both fascinating and melancholic. The final radio transmission, when analysed as a complete sequence, appeared to contain a compressed data package, a summary or conclusion to whatever communication had been intended by the original stellar display. It included what seemed to be confirmation sequences, acknowledging that humanity had detected the phenomenon, reference markers linking back to the geometric patterns that had been displayed. What might have been coordinate data, possibly indicating the direction or location of the intelligence's origin, a closing sequence that matched mathematical patterns from the opening transmissions, suggesting a formal communication structure with defined beginning and end points. "It's like they're signing off," Petrov explained in an accompanying commentary, acknowledging that contact was made, that primitive communication was established, and that the interaction is now concluded. This wasn't an ongoing relationship. It was a discrete event, a cosmic hello and goodbye. The constellation returned to its original configuration 43 days after the reversal began. On a November evening, with multiple observatories monitoring in real time, the final star slid back into its catalogued position. The geometric pattern disappeared, The mathematical signature vanished. The night sky looked exactly as it had for centuries before the anomaly began. Radio telescopes detected one final transmission from the region, a brief burst of highly complex signal lasting approximately 30 seconds. Then the signal ceased entirely. The prime number sequences stopped. The radio sources that had responded to human observation fell silent. The constellation phenomenon was over. Webb stood in his backyard that night, operating his modest telescope, confirming what larger facilities had already reported. Centaurus looked normal. The stars were where ancient astronomers had first catalogued them, where modern databases had always said they should be. If you looked at the sky now, without knowing its recent history, you would see nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that for 18 months these stars had occupied impossible positions, nothing to indicate that cosmic scale intelligence had written a message across light years, then carefully erased it. But Webb knew. The underground research network knew. They had the data, the measurements, the time-lapse sequences showing stars moving in ways that violated every physical principle governing stellar motion. They had witnessed contact. They had documented the moment when humanity learned definitively that we were not alone, that we were observed, that intelligence beyond our comprehension existed and had chosen to announce itself. And then they had watched that evidence be suppressed, normalized, and finally erased by the very intelligence that had created it. In the months following the constellation's return to normal, the astronomical community processed the event with strange quietness. The researchers who had been part of the underground network knew what they'd seen, but they also recognized that without the physical evidence continuing to exist in the sky, their claims would become increasingly difficult to defend. Official databases now showed the constellation positions as stable throughout the entire period. Modified archives gave no indication that anything had ever been different. Future astronomers examining records would find no evidence of the phenomenon unless they discovered preserved copies of original data, copies that Webb and his colleagues maintained, but had limited ability to verify as authentic. The constellation phenomenon was becoming myth, a story told by a small group of astronomers about an extraordinary event that mainstream science would increasingly treat as misunderstanding, mass delusion, or creative fiction. Webb updated his hidden archive with the final data, documenting the constellation's return to normal with the same meticulous care he'd applied to documenting its initial displacement. He added a final entry to the Centaurus manuscript. The phenomenon has concluded. The stars have returned to their natural positions. The message, if that's what it was, has been withdrawn. We are left with data, memories, and unanswerable questions. What did they want? Why did they reveal themselves and then hide again? Were they disappointed in our response? Satisfied? Indifferent? We have no way to know. What we do know is that for a brief period in human history, we were shown definitively that we are not the universe's only intelligence. We were given proof of observation and capability that should have transformed our civilization's self-understanding, and we responded with institutional suppression, selective attention, and eventual forgetting. Perhaps that response tells them and tells us something important about where humanity stands in its development. We are technologically sophisticated enough to detect their presence, but socially and politically too fragmented to engage with it meaningfully. The sky watches us still, I suspect, but now it watches silently, without the elaborate demonstration that marked these past months. Perhaps they will try again in the future, when we've matured sufficiently to meet contact with appropriate wonder and wisdom. Perhaps they've concluded we're not worth the effort. Perhaps they've moved on to observe other worlds, other civilizations at different stages of development. We may never know, but the evidence exists, preserved in hidden archives, maintained by those of us who still believe that truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Someday, when humanity is ready, this data might help us understand what happened and what it meant. Until then, we watch the sky, we maintain our observations, we remember what the stars briefly revealed and what that revelation implied about our place in a cosmos far stranger and more inhabited than we typically acknowledge. The stars moved, someone spoke, we failed to adequately listen. But perhaps that failure is not permanent. Perhaps given time and growth, humanity will become capable of the conversation that the constellation phenomenon was offering to begin. I believe that day will come. I believe we will mature into our cosmic context. And when that happens, those who maintain these records now will have preserved the evidence of our first tentative, imperfect encounter with intelligence beyond our world. The sky watches back. It has always watched. Now at least, a few of us know to watch in return. Webb saved the document, backed it up across his distributed archive network, and closed his laptop. Outside, the stars burned in their ancient patterns, looking exactly as they had for millennia. But Webb knew better. He knew what those stars had been capable of. He knew what they had briefly spelled out in geometric precision across the darkness. And he knew that somewhere, somehow, something vast and incomprehensible was still out there. Still observing, still waiting, still maintaining its patient watch over a species that had not quite been ready for the message written in starlight. The constellation had moved, the stars had spoken, and humanity, for better or worse, had experienced its first cosmic contact. What we would do with that knowledge, whether we would eventually rise to meet it or continue retreating into comfortable ignorance, remained to be seen. But the evidence existed, the record was preserved, and those who maintained it would continue watching the sky, hoping for the day when humanity would be ready to look back with clear eyes and open minds. The conversation was not over. It had merely been postponed. And in the deep darkness between stars, something ancient and patient continued its vigil, waiting for the moment when humanity would finally be ready to truly listen. There are spaces in our cities that should not exist, not because they're dangerous, not because they're forbidden, but because geometrically, architecturally, physically, they simply should not fit, and yet they do. This is the story of someone who found one of those spaces, not in a haunted mansion, not in an abandoned facility, but in a completely ordinary apartment building in a completely ordinary city. It began with a simple observation, a mistake perhaps, a counting error. Except it was not a mistake, and what lay behind that error would force one person to reconsider what it means to be observed, and by whom. This is the story of the floor above the ceiling. Chapter 1. The count that never matches. I moved into the building in late September. It was one of those older structures you find scattered throughout the city. Red brick facade, narrow hallways, radiators that clanked at night. Built sometime in the early 1960s, maybe earlier. The kind of place that had survived decades of rezoning, renovations, and ownership changes without losing its original bones. My apartment was on the 7th floor. The lease said 7th floor. The elevator button I pressed every day said 7. The number beside my door said 703. Everything was straightforward. Until one evening, standing on the sidewalk across the street with a bag of groceries in one hand, I looked up at the building and counted the floors. 8. I counted again. Still 8. I stood there on the sidewalk, shifting the grocery bag to my other hand, squinting up at the building in the fading light of early autumn. The sun was setting behind the structure, casting long shadows across the brick facade. I counted the rows of windows from bottom to top, marking each floor carefully in my mind. Ground floor, 2nd floor, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. 8 distinct levels, 8 rows of windows, 8 floors. But I lived on the 7th floor, the top floor. My lease said so. The building directory in the lobby said so. Everyone I had spoken to said so. I crossed the street and walked half a block down, then turned and looked again, from a different angle. Maybe the perspective had been wrong. Maybe the roofline had created an optical illusion. But no, from this angle it was even clearer. 8 floors, undeniably 8. I went inside. The lobby was empty, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of someone's television playing through the walls. I walked to the elevator and pressed the up button. The panel beside the elevator showed 7 buttons. Basement, ground, floors 2 through 7. 7 floors. I took the elevator to my floor, stepped out into the familiar hallway, walked to the stairwell at the end of the corridor and pushed through the heavy metal door. The stairwell was painted an industrial grey-green, the kind of colour that exists only in older buildings. The steps were concrete. The railing was cold metal. I started at the top and began descending, counting each flight carefully. 7 to 6. 1 flight, 6 to 5, 2 flights, 5 to 4, 3 flights, 4 to 3, 4 flights, 3 to 2, 5 flights, 2 to ground, 6 flights, ground to basement, 7 flights, 7 floors total. I stood in the stairwell between the ground floor and the basement, my hand resting on the railing, trying to reconcile the numbers. 8 floors from the outside, 7 floors from the inside. I climbed back up to the 7th floor, pushed through the stairwell door, and walked to the window at the end of the hallway. It faced the street. I looked down at the sidewalk where I had been standing minutes earlier, then looked up, trying to see if there was something above me. A rooftop structure maybe, a mechanical room, but there was nothing visible from this angle. Just the ceiling of the hallway, ordinary white acoustic tiles marked with the occasional water stain. I went back to my apartment and tried to let it go, but I could not. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the missing floor, or the extra floor, depending on how you counted. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings are strange. Architectural plans change during construction. Basements sometimes count as floors from the outside, but not from the inside. Mezzanines exist. Utility levels exist. There were a dozen rational explanations, but none of them felt right. I got up and went to my window, looked across the street at the building opposite mine, counted its floors, then counted the windows on my own building, visible in the reflection of the glass across the street. 8 floors. I did it again the next day. From the street, 8 floors. From the stairwell, 7. I asked my neighbour across the hall, a man in his 50s who had lived there for over a decade. His name was Marcus. He worked from home and always seemed to be shuffling between his apartment and the trash chute wearing the same flannel bathrobe. "How many floors does this building have?" I asked him one afternoon, when we both happened to be checking our mail in the lobby. He glanced up from the stack of envelopes in his hand. 7, why? "Just curious. Someone told me it was 8. "Nope, 7. Been here 12 years. Always been 7. "You ever been on the roof?" "No. Building manager keeps it locked. Why are you asking?" "No reason. Just trying to get a sense of the place." He shrugged and went back to sorting his mail. I counted again that night. Same result. 8 from the outside, 7 from the inside. The difference sat in my mind like a splinter I could not remove. I started taking different routes to and from the building, walking around the block, looking at it from every angle. The count never changed. From every external perspective, the building had 8 floors, but from every internal perspective, it had 7. I began sketching the building's layout in a notebook, measuring the height of each floor by counting bricks on the facade, calculating the ceiling heights, trying to find where the extra space could be hidden. The math did not add up. If the building was 8 stories tall externally, and each floor had a ceiling height of approximately 10 feet, which was standard for buildings of that era, then the total height should be around 80 feet, plus the roof. I estimated the building's height from the street. It was definitely around 80 to 85 feet. But if there were only 7 accessible floors internally, each with 10-foot ceilings, that left at least 10 to 15 feet of space unaccounted for, a missing floor, or something occupying the space where a floor should be. I started paying attention to the other residents, watching how they moved through the building, listening to how they talked about it. No one ever mentioned an 8th floor. No one ever seemed to notice the discrepancy. It was as if I were the only person who had ever counted. Chapter 2. The elevator delay. It started happening about 2 weeks after I moved in. I would press the button for the 7th floor. The elevator would begin its ascent, the motor humming in its familiar rhythm, the cables creaking slightly as the car rose through the shaft. And then, somewhere between the 6th and 7th floors, it would pause, not stop. Pause. The lights would flicker once, just once, and the elevator would hang there in the shaft for maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. No alarm, no mechanical grinding, just silence and that faint electrical hum that all elevators make. Then it would continue upward and open at my floor as if nothing had happened. At first I thought it was a mechanical issue. Old buildings have old elevators. Things lag, cables slip, motors hesitate. I had lived in enough aging apartments to know that minor malfunctions were part of the experience, but it kept happening. Not every time, but often enough to establish a pattern. Always in the same place, always between 6 and 7, and always with that single flicker of the lights. I started paying closer attention, watching the floor indicator as the elevator climbed. The numbers would illuminate in sequence, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the light would flicker, and there would be that pause. And then 7 would light up, and the doors would open. But during the pause, no number was illuminated. The indicator was dark, as if for those few seconds the elevator existed in a space that had no designation. One night, I stood in the elevator with my hand pressed flat against the wall during the pause. The wall was vibrating, not violently, just a low, steady hum, like the building itself was breathing, like something large and mechanical was operating just beyond the thin metal panel. The vibration felt intentional, controlled, not the random shudder of old machinery. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, I stepped out quickly, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I started experimenting, taking the elevator at different times of day, riding it up and down repeatedly, trying to find a pattern, The pause happened most frequently late at night, between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning. During the day, it was less common, but it still happened. I tried pressing different floor buttons to see if the pause occurred in other parts of the shaft. It did not. The elevator moved smoothly between all other floors. Only between 6 and 7 did it hesitate. I tried riding the elevator with other residents to see if they noticed. They did not. Or if they did not react. They stood there scrolling on their phones or staring at the floor indicator, completely unbothered by the pause. One evening, I rode the elevator with an older woman from the 5th floor. I had seen her before, but never spoken to her. She was carrying a small dog in a canvas tote bag. The elevator began to rise. We passed the 3rd floor, the 4th, the 5th. She got off without a word. I continued alone. The elevator climbed to 6. Then came the pause. I watched the floor indicator. The light flickered. The number went dark. And in that moment, I heard something. A sound from beyond the elevator shaft. Faint but distinct. Footsteps, not below me, not above me, beside me, as if someone were walking in a hallway that ran parallel to the elevator shaft. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Then the elevator resumed its climb. The number 7 lit up, and the doors opened onto my floor. I stood there staring at the empty hallway, my pulse racing. I mentioned it to the building manager the next week during a chance encounter in the lobby. His name was Leonard. He was a man in his 60s with the perpetually tired expression of someone who had been dealing with tenant complaints for far too long. "Elevator's been acting weird," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Pauses between floors sometimes." He nodded without looking up from his clipboard. "Yeah, we know. It is old. We are working on it." "Has anyone else complained?" "Not recently." "Do you know what is causing it?" He sighed and finally looked at me. "It is an old building. Old elevator. These things happen. We have a technician scheduled to look at it next month." "Next month?" "Unless it is an emergency, that is the best I can do." I wanted to push further, to ask if he had ever heard footsteps between floors, to ask if he knew about the missing floor. But something in his expression told me the conversation was over. He walked away before I could say anything else. That night, I took the elevator down to the basement. I wanted to see the bottom of the shaft, to see if there was any visible evidence of the extra space. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of old concrete and heating oil. There were storage units lining one wall and a mechanical room behind a locked metal door. I walked to where I estimated the elevator shaft would be. The wall was smooth brick, no doors, no access panels, no indication that anything unusual existed beyond it. I pressed my ear against the wall. Silence. I stood there for several minutes listening, and then faintly I heard it. That same low hum. The same vibration coming from somewhere inside the wall. Chapter 3. The Maintenance Map. I am not someone who goes looking for locked rooms, but I am someone who notices when a door that is usually closed is suddenly ajar. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just come back from a run and was heading toward the stairwell to stretch when I saw it. The utility room door on the ground floor, propped open with a rubber doorstop. Inside, I could see shelves stacked with cleaning supplies, a mop bucket, a metal ladder leaning against the wall. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete floors and exposed pipes running along the ceiling. And on the far wall, illuminated by a single bare bulb, was a laminated map of the building. I glanced down the hallway. Empty. I could hear someone moving around on the floor above, footsteps muffled by carpet and distance, but no one was nearby. I stepped inside. The map was large, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, printed on thick laminated paper and mounted to a corkboard. It showed the building in cross-section, with each floor drawn in clean blue lines. The plumbing was marked in blue, the electrical in red, the structural elements in black. Each floor was labelled clearly: basement, ground floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor, fifth floor, sixth floor. And then, in a space that should not have existed, tucked between the sixth and seventh floors, there was another label. It was printed smaller than the others, in a different font, as if it had been added later. The line indicating the floor was thinner, almost tentative. The label read, "Observation level, restricted access." No apartment numbers, no utility notations, no indication of what the space was used for. Just those 4 words. Observation level, restricted access. I leaned closer, studying the map. The space occupied by the observation level was narrow, perhaps only 8 feet of vertical clearance, but it spanned the entire footprint of the building. The diagram showed no stairs leading to it, no elevator access, no doorways. But there were markings, small symbols I did not recognise, geometric shapes, circles, triangles, squares, positioned at regular intervals throughout the level. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the map. Just as I pressed the shutter button, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. I slipped my phone into my pocket and quickly stepped out of the room, trying to look casual. A maintenance worker walked past, a man in his 30s wearing coveralls and carrying a toolbox. He glanced at me, but did not stop, just nodded and continued toward the basement stairwell. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and rode up to my floor. That night, I studied the photo on my phone, zooming in on the observation level, trying to decipher the symbols. They were arranged in a grid pattern. Each symbol corresponded to a specific location on the floor plan, and beneath each symbol was a small alphanumeric code. I tried searching online for similar symbols, building codes, architectural notation, engineering diagrams. I found nothing that matched. The next morning, I went back to the utility room. The door was locked. I tried the handle twice just to be sure. Locked. I knocked. No answer. I went to the building manager's office on the ground floor. Leonard was sitting behind a desk covered in paperwork, drinking coffee from a chipped mug. "I have a question about the building layout," I said. He looked up. "What about it?" "I saw a map in the utility room yesterday. It showed something called an observation level." "What is that?" His expression did not change, but there was a brief pause before he answered, just long enough to be noticeable. "We do not have an observation level," he said flatly. "The map showed it, between the 6th and 7th floors." "That is old. The map is outdated. We had some plans years ago that never went through. Someone probably forgot to update the print." "What were the plans for?" "I do not know, before my time." "Can I see a current map?" "We do not have one available for tenants." He turned back to his paperwork, making it clear the conversation was over. I left the office and went back to the utility room. The door was still locked, but now there was a new sign taped to it. "Authorised personnel only." The sign had not been there an hour ago. Chapter 4. Sounds from above. I do not sleep well in new places. It takes me weeks to adjust to the ambient noise of a new building. The pipes clanking at odd hours. The neighbours walking overhead. The way sound travels through walls and ceilings in patterns I have not yet learned to ignore. But this was different. It started about a month after I moved in. I would be lying in bed, almost asleep, when I would hear it. Footsteps, not hurried, not random, slow, deliberate, methodical, the sound of someone walking back and forth across a room. At first I assumed it was the apartment above me. Maybe someone who worked night shifts. Maybe someone with insomnia. Except there was no apartment above me. I was on the 7th floor, the top floor. According to every official document, Every directory, every conversation I had had with building management and residents, there was nothing above me except the roof. But the footsteps continued. They always happened at night, never during the day, never in the early evening, only after midnight, and they always followed the same pattern. A slow walk from one side of the ceiling to the other, a pause, then back again, the same route, the same rhythm, over and over. The first few times I tried to convince myself it was something else. Pipes expanding, the building settling, rodents in the walls, but the sound was too distinct, too heavy, too regular. It was the sound of someone walking. I started timing it. The footsteps would begin around 12:30 in the morning. They would continue for approximately 20 minutes. Then they would stop, always at the same time, always after exactly 20 minutes. I tried staying awake to listen more carefully. I would lie in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to begin. And when it did, I would focus on it, trying to determine the weight, the gait, the purpose. The steps were slow, measured, not the quick pace of someone moving through a space, more like someone inspecting something, observing something, walking back and forth, pausing, continuing. One night, I could not take it anymore. I stood on a chair in the middle of my bedroom and pressed my ear directly against the ceiling. The footsteps were clearer that way, heavier, more deliberate, and I could hear something else beneath them. A faint mechanical sound, a low hum, almost like the sound I had heard in the elevator during the pauses. I pressed harder against the ceiling, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I held my breath, ear still pressed to the ceiling. And then, directly above where I was standing, I heard a different sound. A click, like something opening or closing. I stepped down from the chair and backed away from the ceiling, my heart pounding. The footsteps did not resume. The next day I mentioned the sounds to Marcus, my neighbour across the hall. I caught him in the hallway as he was leaving his apartment. "You ever hear anything at night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Like footsteps?" He frowned. "No, why?" "I keep hearing something above me, like someone walking around." "There is nothing above you. You're on the top floor." "I know, but I definitely hear something." He gave me a look that was somewhere between concern and dismissal. "Old buildings make noise, pipes, ducts, stuff expands and contracts. You will get used to it. It does not sound like pipes. What else would it be?" I did not have an answer. He shrugged. "Give it time. You are still new here. Everything sounds weird at first." But I did not get used to it. The footsteps continued every night. Always the same pattern. Always the same duration. I started recording them on my phone. I would place the phone on my nightstand and let it run while I tried to sleep. In the morning, I would listen to the recordings. The footsteps were there, clear and unmistakable. But there was something else too, something I had not noticed in real time. Between the footsteps, there were other sounds, faint, almost imperceptible. Voices, not words I could understand, not conversations I could follow, just the low murmur of voices, like someone speaking in a distant room. I played the recordings over and over, trying to isolate the sounds, trying to make sense of them. But the more I listened, the less sense it made, because the voices were not coming from above me. They were coming from all around me. Chapter 5. The neighbour who knows her name was Evelyn. She lived on the 5th floor and had been in the building for over 30 years. I had seen her before, moving slowly through the lobby with a canvas shopping bag, always dressed in layers even in warm weather. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen a great deal and had stopped being surprised by most of it. I met her in the lobby one afternoon while checking my mail. I was sorting through the usual stack of junk mail and bills when she appeared beside me, moving so quietly I had not heard her approach. "You are new," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Yeah, been here a couple months." She nodded slowly, studying me with pale blue eyes that seemed to look past the surface of things. "7th floor? That is right. How did you know?" "I pay attention." She paused, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You have noticed it, have you not?" My pulse quickened. "Noticed what?" "The floor that is not there." I glanced around the lobby instinctively, checking if anyone else was nearby. We were alone except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. She gestured for me to follow her to the far corner of the lobby, away from the mailboxes and the elevator. When we were out of the direct line of sight from the entrance, she spoke again. "When I first moved in," she said quietly, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, "this building had 8 floors. Not 7, 8. What happened to it? They closed it." She said this as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Said there were complaints, never said what kind, just closed it off one day. Sealed the elevator access, removed it from the directory, told everyone it had never existed. When was this? 1994, maybe 95, long time ago now. Why would they close an entire floor? She shook her head slowly. No one would say, but people talked. You know how it is. People always talk. What did they say? She paused, her gaze drifting to the elevator doors across the lobby. They said strange things happened up there. People would go up and come back different. Not hurt, not physically, just different. Like they had forgotten something important, or remembered something they should not have. Different how? Hard to explain. You would see them in the hallway, and they would look right through you. Or they would answer questions you had not asked yet. Or they would avoid certain parts of the building without being able to say why. Do you know anyone who went up there? I knew someone once, a man named Thomas. He lived on the 6th floor, said he found a way in through the stairwell. A door that was not supposed to be there, went up one night because he was curious. What did he see? She hesitated, her expression darkening slightly. He said it was just hallways, empty rooms, but the rooms were wrong, shaped wrong. The walls were not straight, and he said the walls reflected things. What kind of things? Things that were not there, or things that had not happened yet. He was not clear about it. He only talked about it once, and then he stopped, said he did not want to think about it anymore. What happened to him? He moved out 2 weeks later, middle of the night, left most of his things behind. Never spoke to anyone in the building again. I tried to reach him later, sent a letter to the forwarding address he left. It came back undeliverable. Do you think he was telling the truth? She looked at me directly. I think he saw something he was not supposed to see, and I think whoever closed that floor did not want anyone seeing it again. Who closed it? Building ownership changed hands around that time. New company, corporate, out of state. They sent contractors in for a week, sealed everything up, repainted the stairwell, reprogrammed the elevator. When they were done, it was like the 8th floor had never existed. But you remember it. Of course I remember it. I am old, not senile. I remember when this building had 8 floors. I remember the apartments up there. I remember the people who lived in them. What happened to those people? They were relocated, different floors, different buildings. Some of them just left. No one questioned it. People do not ask questions when large companies tell them to move. Do you know what the floor was used for? She shook her head. Not officially, but I will tell you this. I lived here for 3 years before they closed it, and in all that time, I never saw anyone going up to the 8th floor. Not once. The elevator would stop there sometimes. but no one would get out, and no one would get in. Then what was it for? I do not know. But I know it is still there. They did not tear it down. They just hid it. How do you know? She smiled faintly. Because I can still hear it. Hear what? The sounds. Late at night. Footsteps. Machinery. Voices. Coming from above the 7th floor. I have been hearing them for 30 years. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hear them too. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Then you are paying attention. Most people do not. They hear the sounds and tell themselves it is the pipes, it is the wind, it is the building settling. They do not want to know. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked, and because I am old enough not to care about the consequences of talking about it. She paused, then added, and because I think you're going to find a way up there eventually. People like you always do. What do you mean? People like me? People who notice things, people who cannot let things go, people who count. She turned and walked toward the elevator without another word, leaving me standing alone in the corner of the lobby. I watched her press the call button and wait. When the elevator arrived and the doors opened, she stepped inside and turned to face me. "Be careful," she said, as the doors began to close. "Whatever is up there, it is still watching." The doors slid shut. I stood there for a long time, processing what she had told me. An 8th floor that used to exist, complaints, strange behaviour, a man who went up and never spoke about it again, and the building ownership that closed it all down and pretended it had never been there. I went back to my apartment and pulled up property records online. It took some digging, but I found the information. The building had changed ownership in 1994, sold to a company called Helix Property Management, corporate headquarters listed in Delaware, no website, no public information beyond the basic registration documents. I searched for other properties owned by Helix. There were dozens, apartment buildings scattered across the country, all of them older structures, all of them in major cities. I cross-referenced the addresses with satellite imagery, counting the floors visible from above. Every single building had a discrepancy. One extra floor visible from the outside that did not appear in the internal layout. Every single one. Chapter 6. The open door. It happened on a Thursday night. I had been working late, staying up past midnight, trying to finish a project that had been dragging for weeks. I finally gave up around 11 and decided to call it a night. I locked my apartment door and walked to the elevator, exhausted and ready for sleep. I pressed the button for the 7th floor, force of habit, even though I was already on 7, and leaned against the elevator wall as the doors slid closed. Wait. I had pressed the button for the 7th floor, but I was already on the 7th floor. The elevator should not have moved, but it did. I felt the slight lurch as the car began to rise. I straightened up, suddenly alert. The floor indicator above the doors showed 7, but the elevator was definitely ascending. I pressed the button for 7 again. Nothing happened. I pressed the emergency stop button. Nothing happened. The elevator continued upward. The lights flickered. And then, just as they always did between the 6th and 7th floors, they steadied again. Except this time, the doors opened. I stepped forward instinctively, expecting to see my hallway. Instead, I saw something else entirely. The hallway was different. Not dramatically, but fundamentally, subtly, in ways that my brain registered immediately as wrong. The walls were smooth, too smooth, no texture, no imperfections, no paint roller marks or patches or nail holes. Just perfectly uniform surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The floor was grey, not carpet, not tile, something else, something I could not identify. It had a slight give to it when I stepped out of the elevator, like walking on rubber, but it made no sound. The lighting came from nowhere, and everywhere at once. No fixtures, no bulbs, no visible source, just a soft, even glow that eliminated all shadows. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet, maybe less. It created a sense of compression, of being in a space not designed for human comfort. And lining both sides of the hallway were doors, grey doors, evenly spaced, identical, no numbers, no markings, just smooth surfaces, the same shade of grey as the floor. I stood in the doorway of the elevator, one hand holding the door open, staring down the hallway. There was no sound, no hum from the lights, no distant voices from apartments, no mechanical noise from HVAC systems, no ambient noise at all. Just silence. Complete, absolute silence. I stepped out fully, and the elevator doors closed immediately behind me. I spun around. There was no call button, no panel, no visible mechanism to summon the elevator back. Just a smooth wall, the same grey as everything else. I pressed my hand against where the doors had been. Solid, seamless. I turned back to the hallway. It stretched in both directions, identical in every way. Doors evenly spaced, walls perfectly straight, lighting uniform. I could not tell which direction led to the front of the building and which led to the back. There were no windows, no exit signs, no indicators of any kind. I chose a direction at random and started walking. My footsteps made no sound on the strange grey floor. The air felt wrong, not cold, not warm, just neutral. Temperature controlled to be completely unnoticeable. I reached the first door. It had no handle, no keyhole, no visible means of opening, just a smooth grey surface, slightly recessed into the wall, and in the centre of the door, at eye level, there was a panel. Not a window, not glass, something else. It looked like a mirror or a screen. A perfectly rectangular panel, maybe 12 inches by 18 inches, set flush with the door. I leaned closer to examine it, and then I saw my reflection. Except it was not my reflection. It was me, but from 5 seconds ago. Still standing by the elevator, reaching out to touch the wall where the doors had been. I stepped back quickly, my pulse spiking. The reflection did not follow. It continued moving forward, reaching out toward where I'd just been standing. I watched as the reflection me touch the wall, hesitated, then turned and started walking down the hallway. Toward where I was standing now, I moved to the door across the hall. The same thing. Another panel, another reflection, but this one was ahead of me in time. It showed me standing in front of the door, leaning close to the panel, examining it, which I had not done yet. I was about to do it. I stepped back from the door, breathing hard. The reflection showed me stepping back, exactly as I was doing in real time. For a brief moment, we were synchronized. Then the reflection moved forward again, leaning toward the panel before I did. I moved down the hallway faster now, checking each door. Every single one had a panel. Every single panel showed a reflection, some lagging, some leading, all slightly out of sync. I saw myself walking, stopping, turning around, reaching out to touch doors, pressing my hands against walls, versions of me scattered across time, seconds apart, minutes apart, all trapped in the panels, all being observed. I started walking faster, looking for an end to the hallway, looking for stairs, for an exit sign, for anything that would tell me how to leave. But the hallway just continued. Door after door, panel after panel, reflection after reflection. I stopped in front of one door and stared at the panel. This one showed me in my apartment, standing by the window, looking out at the street. But I was not in my apartment. I was here. I pressed my hand against the panel. It was warm, Not hot, just warm, like touching skin. I pulled my hand back quickly and kept moving. The hallway curved slightly, not sharply, just a gentle arc to the left. I followed it, and at the end of the curve there was an opening, not a door, just an open doorway leading into a larger space. I hesitated at the threshold, listening. Silence. I stepped inside. Chapter 7. The Rooms That Observe. The room was vast, circular, or maybe octagonal. It was difficult to tell. The walls curved in ways that made precise geometry uncertain. And covering every surface, every wall from floor to ceiling were panels. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands, each one displaying something different. Not screens, not monitors, not anything technological I recognised. Just windows. That is the only way I can describe them. Windows into other places. I stepped further into the room, my eyes trying to process what I was seeing. Some panels showed rooms, living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens. Some showed hallways, stairwells, lobbies. Some showed outdoor spaces, streets, parks, parking lots. And in many of them there were people going about their lives, sitting, walking, eating, sleeping, working, all being watched, all being observed. I moved closer to the nearest panel. It showed an apartment living room. A woman was sitting on a couch, reading a book. She looked up occasionally, glanced at her phone, then went back to reading. The view was from above, as if the camera, or whatever was recording, was positioned in the ceiling, looking straight down. I recognised the style of the couch, the type of lamp, the layout. It looked like the apartments in my building. I moved to the next panel. A man in a kitchen cooking dinner. Same overhead perspective, same style of apartment. The panel next to it showed an empty hallway. My hallway. The 7th floor hallway of my building. And then I saw it. A panel showing my apartment. The view was from directly above. I could see my couch, my desk, my bed in the other room, the book I had left open on the coffee table, the jacket hanging on the back of my chair. Everything exactly as I had left it less than an hour ago. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The panel was live, real time. I could see the clock on my wall, the seconds ticking forward. I looked away and scanned the other panels. There were hundreds of views of apartments, different layouts, different furniture, different people. But not all from my building. Some were clearly from other buildings. Different architectural styles. Different cities, maybe. I moved deeper into the room, following the curve of the wall, more panels, more views, a laundromat. People doing laundry, folding clothes, sitting in plastic chairs waiting for cycles to finish. A subway platform. Commuters waiting for trains. Some on their phones. Some reading. Some just staring into space. An office. Rows of cubicles. People working at computers. A grocery store. People pushing carts down aisles. Selecting items from shelves. All from overhead perspectives. All with that same clean, detached clarity. I kept walking. Some panels showed locations I did not recognise, cities I had never been to, buildings I could not identify. And then I saw a panel that made me stop completely. It showed this room, the observation room I was standing in. But the view was from above, from a perspective I could not locate, from somewhere beyond the ceiling. And in the panel, I could see myself standing there, looking up at the panels. I spun around, searching the ceiling. It was smooth, featureless, the same grey as the walls, no visible cameras, no lenses, no openings. But somehow, I was being watched from above. I looked back at the panel. I raised my hand slowly. In the panel, my reflection raised its hand a full second later. The delay was consistent with what I had seen in the hallway. some reflections lagging, some leading. But this was different. This was not a reflection. This was observation. I lowered my hand and moved to another section of the room. More panels, more locations. And then I started noticing patterns. The panels were organised, not randomly arranged. They were grouped by location, by building. One section showed views from what appeared to be my building. Different apartments, different floors, different angles. Another section showed views from a different building, a different city. The panels were labelled, small alphanumeric codes in the corner of each view. I recognised the format. It matched the codes I had seen on the maintenance map, the map of the observation level. Each code corresponded to a specific location, a specific viewpoint. This was not surveillance. This was not security. This was something else, something systematic, organised, intentional. I moved to the centre of the room. There was a structure there, not a desk, not a console, just a raised platform, maybe 3 feet in diameter, made of the same grey material as everything else. On the platform was an object. I could not tell what it was made of. It looked metallic, but the surface seemed to shift slightly, like oil on water. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a basketball, with geometric patterns etched into its surface. I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, every panel in the room changed. All at once, every view shifted to show the same thing. Me. Hundreds of panels, thousands of views, all showing me from different angles, different perspectives, different moments in time. Me walking down the hallway, me standing in the elevator, me in my apartment, me on the street, me in the lobby, me everywhere. I jerked my hand back from the sphere. The panels shifted back to their original views. Apartments, streets, offices, stores. I backed away from the platform, my breathing rapid and shallow, and then I heard it. A sound behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I turned. The doorway I had entered through was still open, but standing in the threshold was a figure. I could not see it clearly. The lighting in the room was too uniform, and the figure seemed to blend with the walls, as if it were made of the same material. But it was definitely there, and it was definitely watching me. I did not wait to see what it would do. I ran. Chapter 8. The Purpose Revealed. I do not remember the route I took through the hallways. I just ran. My footsteps still made no sound on the grey floor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. Doors flashing past on either side. Panels reflecting versions of me. Running, stumbling, gasping for breath. I turned corners that I did not remember seeing before. The hallway branched, intersected, curved. I kept running, looking for the elevator, looking for stairs, looking for any way out. And then suddenly, I was back in the circular room. I stopped, disoriented. I had been running away from the room, but somehow I had ended up back inside it. The figure was gone. The panels still displayed their hundreds of views, lives being observed, spaces being monitored. I approached the platform in the centre again, more slowly this time. The sphere was still there, its surface shifting slightly in the light. I did not touch it this time. I just looked at it, studied it, and then I understood. This was not a surveillance system. This was not security footage. This was a study, a systematic observation of human behaviour, human movement, human patterns. The building, my building, was not just an apartment complex. It was a research site, and we, the residents, were the subjects. Not subjects being tested, not subjects being manipulated, just subjects being observed, watched, recorded, catalogued, not for security, not for control, for understanding. Someone or something was studying us, learning how we moved through spaces, how we interacted with our environments, how we lived our daily lives when we thought no one was watching. The observation level was not hidden because it was dangerous. It was hidden because people would leave if they knew they were being watched. I thought about the maintenance map, the label, observation level, restricted access. I thought about the elevator pauses, the moments of suspension between floors, the doorway opening onto a space that should not exist. I thought about Evelyn's story, the 8th floor that used to be accessible, the people who went up and came back different. They had seen this, they had understood what was happening, and they could not process it, so they left, or they forgot, or they convinced themselves it had never happened. I looked at the panels again. All those people, all those lives, all being observed without their knowledge. How many buildings were like this? How many observation levels existed? How many cities had spaces hidden between floors, watching from above? I thought about Helix property management, the dozens of buildings with the same discrepancy, one extra floor visible from the outside. This was not isolated. This was not unique. This was systematic. And then I had another thought. If this was a study, then there were researchers. Someone was reviewing this data, analysing it, drawing conclusions. The figure I had seen in the doorway, was that a researcher or something else? I looked up at the ceiling again, at the smooth grey surface that somehow observed me without visible cameras. And I realised I was not supposed to be here. The observation level was designed to be hidden, inaccessible. The elevator was programmed never to stop here. The stairwell was sealed, the map was removed, but somehow, tonight, the elevator had brought me here. Why? Was it a malfunction? A mistake in the programming? Or was it intentional? I looked back at the panels showing my apartment, my life, my routines. They had been watching me since I moved in. They knew I had noticed the discrepancy. They knew I had been counting floors. They knew I had been asking questions. And tonight they had let me in. Why? To see if I would understand, to see how I would react, or to see if I would tell anyone. I stood there in the centre of the room, surrounded by hundreds of views of human life. And I realised something else. I was part of the study now, not just a subject being observed from above, but a subject who had discovered the observation itself, and that changed the experiment. Chapter 9. The exit that resets. I do not know how long I stood there. Time felt strange in that room, without windows, without sound, without any reference points beyond the ticking seconds visible in some of the panels. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I walked back toward the doorway where I had entered. The hallway beyond was empty. No figure, no movement. I stepped out and started walking, choosing directions at random, hoping to find the elevator. The hallways all looked identical. Same grey walls, same grey floor, same doors with their unsettling panels showing fragmented reflections of time. I turned a corner and found myself facing a dead end. A smooth wall, no doors, no openings. I backtracked and tried a different direction. Another dead end. I tried again and again. Every path seemed to lead nowhere. The hallways looped back on themselves. Intersections led to identical corridors. The architecture was wrong in ways I could not quite articulate. I was starting to panic when I turned one more corner and saw it. The elevator. The same smooth grey doors. The same absence of call buttons. I approached slowly, unsure if it would open, unsure if I wanted it to open. But as I got closer, the doors slid apart silently. Inside was the familiar elevator car. The same worn metal walls. The same flickering fluorescent light. The same scuffed floor. It looked exactly like the elevator in my building. I stepped inside quickly, before the doors could close without me. There was a panel with buttons, 7 floors, basement to 7. No button for the observation level. I pressed 7. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. I felt the movement, smooth, steady, normal. No pause, no flicker, just a straight descent. The floor indicator above the doors showed the numbers counting down. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, ground, basement. Wait, I had pressed 7. Why was it going down past 7? But then the indicator reversed. Basement, ground, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The doors opened. I stepped out into my hallway. The 7th floor hallway of my building. The familiar carpeted floor. The familiar textured walls. The familiar buzzing fluorescent lights. I walked to my apartment, unlocked the door, stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The book on the coffee table, the jacket on the chair, the clock on the wall. I looked at the clock. 11:15. I had left my apartment at 11. I had been gone 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I sat on the couch, my mind racing, trying to process what had happened. I pulled out my phone. The time confirmed it. 11:15. I checked my photos. The picture I had taken of the maintenance map was still there. The only evidence that any of this had happened. I opened my recording app. The audio files of the footsteps were still there. It had happened. It was real. But somehow, almost no time had passed. I stood up and walked to the window, looked out at the street. Everything was normal. Cars passing. A few people walking. The bodega on the corner still lit up. I looked up at my building's reflection in the glass of the building across the street. 7 floors. I counted again. 7 floors. The 8th floor was gone. Chapter 10. The floor is gone. Again. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps. They never came. For the first time since I had moved in, the ceiling was silent. The next morning I went to the utility room. The door was unlocked. I opened it and looked inside. The maintenance map was back on the wall. But it was different. The observation level was gone. The floor plan showed only 7 floors. Basement to 7. No gap, no additional label, no symbols. It was as if the observation level had never existed. I took another picture, compared it to the first one on my phone. The first photo still showed the observation level. The second one did not. 2 different versions of the same map. Both real, both documenting different realities. I checked the elevator, rode it up and down several times. It stopped at 7 floors. No pause between 6 and 7. No flicker of the lights. No moment of suspension. Just a normal elevator in a normal building. I checked the stairwell, counted the flights from bottom to top. 7 floors. I went outside and counted from the street. 7 floors. The discrepancy was gone. I asked Marcus if he had noticed anything unusual lately. He looked at me with concern. Like what? I do not know. Strange sounds, the elevator acting weird. No, why? Are you okay? Yeah, just tired. He nodded slowly. You should get some rest. You look exhausted. I went back to my apartment. That night, I recorded audio again while I tried to sleep. In the morning, I listened to the file. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. No mechanical hum. Just the ambient noise of an old building. Pipes, wind, distant traffic. I checked the panels in my apartment, the smoke detector, the thermostat, the electrical outlets. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I searched online for Helix Property Management again. The company still existed, still owned dozens of buildings. But when I cross-referenced the addresses with satellite imagery again, the discrepancies were gone. Every building now showed the correct number of floors from every angle. Either I had miscounted before, or something had changed. I contacted Evelyn on the 5th floor, knocked on her door one afternoon. She answered, looking tired and older than I remembered. "Do you remember talking to me about the 8th floor?" I asked. She frowned. "What 8th floor? You told me the building used to have 8 floors, that they closed one off in the 90s. "I never said that." "Yes, you did. You told me about a man named Thomas who went up there." She shook her head slowly. "I do not know anyone named Thomas, and this building has always had 7 floors. "Are you sure?" "Of course I am sure. I have lived here for 30 years. 7 floors. Always 7. She closed the door before I could say anything else. I stood in the hallway trying to make sense of it. Either she had forgotten, like the people she had described who went up and came back different, or I had imagined the entire conversation. But I had not imagined it. I was certain. I went back to my apartment and looked at the photos on my phone. The maintenance map showing the observation level. The only evidence I had. But even that felt fragile. How hard would it be to edit a photo, to convince myself I had seen something that was not there? I thought about the panels in the observation room, the reflections showing versions of me scattered across time. Which version was real? Which version was being observed? I sat on my couch and stared at the ceiling. The footsteps never returned. The elevator never paused. The building settled into the normal rhythms of everyday life, but I could still feel it, the weight of something above me, watching, waiting, recording. Epilogue. Why cities are ideal. I have thought about this constantly since that night. If something wanted to study us, truly study us, it would not land in a field. It would not crash in a desert. It would not make itself obvious. It would embed itself in the places we already ignore. Cities are perfect for this. They are layered, dense, anonymous, complex. We move through them without noticing the architecture around us. We trust that the spaces we inhabit are the only spaces that exist. We trust that when we count floors from the outside, the count will match the floors from the inside. We trust that elevators stop at every floor and that stairwells lead everywhere they should. We trust that the ceiling above us is just a ceiling. But what if it is not? What if the buildings we live in contain more space than we realise? What if the floors we walk are just one layer of a much larger structure? What if the rooms we sleep in are being observed by something we cannot see from perspectives we cannot comprehend? We assume that we would notice, that something so large, so invasive, so present would be obvious. But the truth is we are very good at not noticing things, especially things that are designed to be unnoticed. I still live in the building. I still take the elevator to the 7th floor every day. I still hear the ambient sounds of an old structure settling at night. But I also count every day from different angles, and every day the count is the same. 7 floors. But I know what I saw. I know where I went. I know what I discovered in that room with the hundreds of panels showing hundreds of lives. And I know that it is still there. It has to be. Because sometimes late at night, when the building is quiet and the city is sleeping, I will look up at the ceiling and I will feel it. A slight vibration. A faint hum. The sound of something moving in a space that should not exist. The sound of observation. And I wonder, how many other buildings have spaces like this? How many other cities contain floors between floors? How many other people are being watched without knowing? How many of us have walked past doors that do not exist? How many of us have heard footsteps from above and told ourselves it was just the pipes? How many of us have noticed something wrong with our buildings and dismissed it as a counting error? If something wanted to study us quietly, it would not need spaceships. It would not need abductions. It It would not need dramatic displays of technology. It would just need patience and access and the ability to hide in plain sight. It would rent space between our floors. It would observe from our ceilings. It would watch as we went about our lives, completely unaware. And we would never know it was there, unless we counted, unless we noticed, unless we refused to dismiss the discrepancy as a mistake. I think about Evelyn, who does not remember telling me about the 8th floor. I think about Thomas, who saw something and moved away, and never spoke about it again. I think about all the people I saw in those panels, living their lives, unaware they were being observed. And I think about the figure I saw, standing in the doorway of the observation room, the figure that watched me as I watched the panels. Was it human? Was it something else? I do not know, but I know that I was allowed to leave. The elevator brought me back. Time reset. The floor disappeared, almost as if the observation wanted me to know it was there, almost as if it wanted me to tell this story. And maybe that is part of the study too, not just observing how we live, but observing what we do when we discover we are being observed. Do we tell others? Do we stay silent? Do we convince ourselves it was not real? Do we keep counting? I still count, every single day. And every single day the building has 7 floors. But I know the truth. There is a floor above the ceiling, and it is still watching.